A police interview room in 2017. Stephan Hough is cross-examined about a crime committed 44 years earlier.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
This man is violent through and through. It's part of his internal makeup.
But is he a killer? Hours before the body of Janet Cummings was found, the teenage Stephan Hough had been hiding in nearby undergrowth.
He had an alibi for the evening of the murder, which was a strange sort of alibi, but it's one that is often compelling.
Hough would walk free from suspicion as another man was convicted.
We all know there have been miscarriages of justice in the past.
Stephen, are you responsible for those injuries?
No comment.
Stephan Hough went unpunished for 44 years, but then a knock on the door of Janet's mother signalled the reopening of the case.
In May 2016, we went to Irene Cummings' home address in Flint to inform her that North Wales Police were re-investigating the circumstances of Janet's death in 1976.
This was a mystery like few others. Investigators needed to know. Was it Stephan Hough who was responsible for the death of Janet Cummings? Why was Stephan Hough a young man made for murder? Using expert digital imagery from a specialist forensic artist to show the changing faces of a killer, this series reveals the life timelines and the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life.
The violence within this man is extraordinary, and murder was always going to be part of his life story.
Stephan Hough, even at school, someone to avoid.
Stephan Hough attended Flint High School, described by many as being a big, powerful lad, also a bully, was quite intimidating to other pupils.
For him, the bullying was just an inherent part of his way of conducting himself.
Big for his age.
He played sort of rugby for Flint Rugby Club as well, and played again for the senior club, even though he was only 16, 17 years of age, because he was a big, powerful, stocky man.
Dr. Donna Young's a forensic psychologist, trained to reveal the red flags and the timelines of killers, struck by Hough's willingness to put his weight about.
For anybody who knows the signs, there would have been something very animalistic about the way he conducted himself physically.
1976 Flint in North Wales. Population 5,000. A quiet, unassuming town nestled on the River Dee, just 20 miles south of Liverpool in England. A tight-knit community where people knew each other's business.
Flint town was generally a safe place to live. Flint had links to steel manufacturing and so forth. There was a high employment rate as a result of that. And generally, people in Flint felt safe.
It's quite a small community, so pretty much everybody would know everybody one way or the other in a town of that size.
Locals, familiar with each other, a safe place. But that changed one cold winter's afternoon. The Cummings family lived in a bungalow in King Edward's Drive near the town centre. Eileen and Ted had only one child, Janet.
She was a fairly quiet girl. She had a small number of friends, played in the street where she lived. At the end of the previous year, 1975, a new leisure centre had opened in Flint town, not too far from where Janet lived, and Janet and her circle of friends loved going down there to the swimming pool, and that was part of their interests.
On the evening of the 7th of January 1976, 15-year-old Janet Cummings and her mum had a bit of an argument. Janet wanted to go swimming, but her mum thought she looked unwell, so she told Janet she couldn't go. Janet was not to be deterred.
When mum went to check on her about 7:30, She'd seen that Janet had actually left the house, left a note to say she'd gone to the swimming pool, but she would be back at 8:30 p.m, so Mum and Dad weren't too concerned.
A number of friends saw Janet that evening. One saw her at about 7:35 at the swimming baths. Another friend saw Janet at 8:15 in a road near to her house. And a bit later on, Janet went to a friend's house and asked if that friend could come out, but she wasn't allowed. That was the last sighting of Janet alive.
By 12 o'clock, 12 p.m, you can imagine that her parents were very worried indeed, and in fact frantic, so decided to walk down to the police station in Flint and reported her as a missing person. When you consider that Janet had never been missing before, when you consider that she was only 15 years of age, it was a dark, cold winter's night, then the risk associated with that missing person report would undoubtedly be high risk, and the policing response to a high risk missing person is very significant indeed.
Janet was discovered lying under a hedge on the edge of the local primary school field. Her body had been dragged along the ground. She was still clothed, but both shoes were missing.
She was found in the bushes, essentially lying slightly on one side, but on her back. Her body had been semi-concealed, and she'd clearly been murdered.
A post-mortem was carried out, and it was revealed that she had been violently sexually assaulted.
She was the victim of quite a violent sexual assault, which involved both vaginal and anal penetration. I think it's probably occurred at or around the time of her death or slightly afterwards.
The seemingly random nature of the attack would make this a tough investigation, not helped by the limitations of the day.
This is 1976, so there's virtually no CCTV, mobile phones haven't been invented, and forensic science is nothing like what it is today.
The young man responsible for Janet's death was Stephan Hough. He had carried out an appalling sexual assault prior to her death.
I'm firmly of the view that she walked past the back entrance of Stephan Hough's home address, and there he was laying in wait and attacked her at that location. He raped Janet and then smothered her until she actually died.
Understanding Stephan Hough means understanding his nature and motivation, both of which add up to him being lethally dangerous.
The murder itself is not actually the point of the activity. The point of the activity is the rape. The murder is collateral damage. It's an incidental side effect of the brutal way in which he carries out his rapes.
Hough is a sadistic rapist. He gets his kicks from seeing a woman completely overpowered in absolute distress and pain. He's not having sex with her for her privilege and enjoyment. He's doing it to harm her because he has selfish needs.
That attack was a huge warning sign that this was a man made for murder.
Hough had been in the year above Janet at high school, but he was never seriously considered a suspect.
On the day that Janet went missing, Stephan Hough was a 16-year-old boy, 5 days short of his 17th birthday. He lived with his parents very close to where the body of Janet was found, and also no more than about 400 yards from Janet Cummins' home address.
120 police began making door-to-door inquiries. All local men aged 17 to 22 were asked to account for their movements on the night of Janet's murder. Hough was one of them.
He was particularly nervous and couldn't really answer their questions. So the police that were conducting those house inquiries reported that matter to the detectives that were investigating that murder, because they felt that more questions needed to be asked of Stephan Hough.
The questioning removed him from the suspects list.
He had an alibi for the evening of the murder, which was a strange sort of alibi, but it's one that is often compelling.
He denied any knowledge of Janet's killing, but he did admit to being out that evening.
Hough openly told investigators that he had been masturbating in a car at the time of the murder before going on to commit another offence. And that's why he was nervous being interviewed.
He had the best sort of alibi. Not only did I not do this, but I was doing something else. And not the alibi of I don't know where I was. It was I know where I was and I was doing something very specific.
This is a man who will talk about his masturbation openly. This is a man who will try and use the fact that he's stealing as an alibi. He's utterly antisocial in his personality, as well as being psychopathic in his cognitive style.
It would be 40 years before the truth of what he had done that night would be wholly and forensically investigated.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
Stephan Hough had figured out a way to avoid being charged in connection with the rape and death of Janet Cummings. He told officers he was breaking into a car at the time Janet had been murdered.
What he had done was taken the scent from him entirely. The police said, we're now happy with him because he's given us an account. He was clearly nervous because he'd been out committing crime.
He was later charged with that crime, went to magistrates' court and was fined.
The full details of Janet's death were not immediately released to the public. It had been a brutal attack. Police wanted a quick arrest. With Stephan Hough in the clear, another young man, Noel Jones, would soon come under the spotlight. Perfect for Stephan Hough.
This man is a psychopath. His thinking is not in any way touched by morality or empathy.
His plan to get away with Janet's death was helped by what 1970s investigative methods were available to police, and the police's eagerness to charge someone.
Back then in 1976, there was no DNA technology. What could you do with swabs? Well, you can actually analyse those swabs to see if you get a blood grouping from what was identified to be semen, and that came back with a blood group O.
Armed with limited forensic evidence, the detectives turned their attention to who had the opportunity to pounce on Janet.
The police took an interest in members of the travelling fraternity that had set up an illegal encampment about 3 miles away from Flint in a small village called Northup.
An 18-year-old traveller called Noel Jones was arrested for Janet's murder. He was interviewed, but he was barely literate.
His was blood group O, as found at the scene.
Janet Cummings had a vaginal tear and she had an anal tear. Semen was found in the vagina. Now, in those days, when that was analysed, it was the same blood group type as Noel Jones, but then so are thousands and thousands of people in the country.
Unwittingly keeping Hough in the clear, Noel Jones's girlfriend told police that he had confessed to killing Janet. It was not true. He'd said it as part of a row with his girlfriend. Noel Jones suddenly found himself under immense pressure. At first, when questioned, he denied the offence.
Noel Jones went to court in the summer of 1976 and pleaded not guilty. He told his lawyer he wasn't responsible. He told his probation worker that he wasn't responsible and was denying everything to his family as well and saying, I haven't done this.
During this time, Hough remained beyond suspicion. Detectives felt they had their man. The horror of what Janet had suffered and a quirk of the law was about to help those pressing for the prosecution of Noel Jones.
When the judge heard the evidence of the pathologist in this case, where the pathologist said she wasn't actually strangled, there were actually very few injuries to the body of Janet. And what they felt is that whilst she was being raped, she was being smothered as well. The heart stopped as a result of the shock of what was happening. So when the judge heard that, he wasn't convinced that the prosecution could prosecute for murder and offered the alternative charge of manslaughter. Noel Jones, if he'd been convicted of murder, would probably have served in the region of 20 to 25 years in prison. He was told that if he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, he'd probably get about 12 years, but he'd only serve half that sentence.
Having suffered at the hands of other prisoners when on remand, Noel decided that he couldn't cope with a lifelong sentence. He could cope with 6 years.
He pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Janet Cummings, and therefore there's a very strong presumption that anybody who's pleaded guilty to an offence is guilty of that offence.
Guilty of manslaughter, rape and buggery. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison.
It really does beg a belief that it could be, as it was then, that he was spoken to, and within a very, very short time, he'd made an elaborate, complete confession.
Who's a young man who's very vulnerable, has learning difficulties, and essentially is, to some degree, coerced into admitting that he was guilty of the crime.
Stephen Lloyd would come to know the Cummins family well as the police family liaison officer. Members of Janet's family were not convinced by the verdict back then. Lloyd spoke to one, Janet's uncle, Derek.
When Noel Jones was taken out in the police car on the second night, I think, and they drove round Flint, where he's pointing out where he saw Janet first of all, and where he followed her over the fields of Flint High School, you know, almost past Janet's home address, and to the Gorset Stones where they've attacked her. Derek certainly didn't believe that aspect of it, and I never did from 1976, so Derek had his doubts.
Doubts or not, Hough was now decidedly in the clear, and the reduction in the charge from murder to manslaughter would have repercussions 4 decades later, directly affecting the chances of ever charging Stephan Hough with murder. Hough was free to get on with his life, whilst Noel began his sentence.
This man will do whatever it takes to achieve the ends he desires, and he has the presence of mind, the systematic, strategic style of thinking that enables him to follow that through. So this man is a psychopath. His thinking is not in any way touched by morality or empathy. So for him, it was a useful situation when another man was convicted for his first crime.
He obviously thought that his troubles were over when Noah Jones was so publicly tried and so publicly pleaded guilty and served a sentence for it. And there was never any demur from Noah Jones about his guilt. There was never any appeal process, and it was a guilty plea from him, not a finding by a jury. Had it been a finding by a jury, that might have been less comforting.
Stephan Hough goes about his business literally having got away, scot-free, with killing Janet Cummins.
When you are a criminal with sadistic tendencies and you get away with your crime, it bolsters your sense of self. You feel that you are brighter than the police, you can outsmart authorities, and it means that those predilections and desires that you have within your nature, they have a new belief system, which is that you are above the law.
Feeling above the law, Stephan Hough was very much a danger to women.
Stephan Hough is not a one-off adolescent explosive incident kind of attacker.
He was made to attack again. By 1980, Hough decided to leave Flint and start a new life abroad, in the army.
The thing about being in the army is it gives you an opportunity to travel. And what we know about people who join the army who have this nature is they have many, many opportunities to harm vulnerable people along the way. And it's very hard, because of where they are and the travelling, to identify them.
Having so cynically avoided arrest and seen an innocent man convicted, what Hough did next is puzzling.
At the age of 21, whilst he was stationed in Germany, he got married, and he admitted to his wife that he'd killed someone back home. His wife asked him if it was Janet Cummings, but he wouldn't say.
It's hard to know why Hough would have decided to confide in his wife. We could imagine on a human level that he feels some level of guilt, but it could also be power play, a way of letting her know his capabilities and testing her.
It has never been revealed if his then wife believed him, or if she felt too frightened to report the conversation. Hough was still able to plan attacks on women.
Being in the army, you are very, very trusted. It's very rare for any human being to see a person in position of power, a position of protection, to believe that they could be sinister. So it automatically creates leverage. People will feel safe around you, and that gives you an incredible access.
If his uniform camouflaged the intent of a sex attacker, he soon used it.
The receptionist incident is where it all came together for me.
He carried out an attack at a hotel. Stephan Hough had been out drinking for most of the day. This female walked into the toilets, closely followed by Stephan Hough. He attacked that female and he strangled her to the point that she passed out. And they were disturbed, or so he was disturbed, and ran away. But witnesses were able to say that he was clearly British because he still had his uniform on. Inquiries led them to Stephan Hough. Stephan Hough was charged with grievous bodily harm.
Hough was thrown out of the army for the attack and in 1988 was sentenced to 5 years in a military prison.
It's violence against a stranger. It's not violence that's triggered by any kind of emotional build-up, which is what we ordinarily see. It's violence that is out of all proportion. It's extreme violence that is readily triggered. And then there's the abductive quality to the violence, where Hough wants to get his victim away in private so he can relish the act of carrying out the attack on her, is a frightening indicator of somebody for whom violence is a purely focused pleasure.
By the 90s, living back in his hometown of Flint, Stephan Hough was now in his second marriage and had 2 children.
He was a long-distance lorry driver, doing most of his journeys abroad. And that was something which perplexed all of us, that had he had the opportunity, as he clearly did, to make a new life in a different country, he could have done. But he returned to his home, he stayed in the same place in Flint, lived there in the same street he'd grown up in, and was there for everybody to see.
How would justice ever catch up with Stephan Hough?
It was disclosed to him that his semen had been found on Janet's trouser leg, and semen had been found on intimate samples taken from Janet as well, where he crossed his arms and went no comment to every question after that. It seemed a bit bizarre, really.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
Stephan Hough lived under the radar throughout the 90s and into the new century.
This is a predator who will be walking among us freely.
But justice began to move in on him because of retained evidence found on Janet's body 4 decades earlier. Police had always known that swabs taken at the time indicated there was a potential second attacker. Advances in DNA tracing meant that North Wales Police could hold a case review.
In 2006, an officer who was working on that investigation decided there may be merits in having a look at what was uncovered forensically from that, to see actually was there a potential second person involved in that killing.
A new DNA imprint was found, but could not be matched with anyone on the national database. So little help to Noel Jones, who was by now living a new life.
Detectives were no doubt disappointed when the national DNA database did not throw up a match for the samples retrieved from Janet's body.
The lack of a match, however, did not detract from the facts, which were now clear. Evidence suggested Janet had indeed suffered at the hands of an attacker other than Noel Jones. Perhaps Noel Jones was an innocent man.
I became concerned about the original conviction, and felt that there was this very strong possibility that this was a miscarriage of justice.
With no more leads, the case was cold. Hough was still in the clear. It was now a waiting game. Police had DNA from an unknown man found on Janet's body in Flint in 1976, and no more.
We decided to upload it onto the national database to see if, at any time in the future, that would actually hit against a person that may be of interest to that inquiry.
To avoid detection, all Hough had to do was to commit no further crimes. But in 2016, literally on his home turf, Stephan Hough was unable to resist temptation.
Stephan Hough is arrested in connection with allegations of a similar nature to those surrounding Janet's disappearance and death.
He allowed a child to have a party at his home, and during the course of that party, people drank rather more than they should have done, and he became embroiled in physical contact with one of those there, which left his mark in the form of DNA.
His DNA was taken and it was loaded onto the database, and it gave a direct hit between that swab result from the trousers of Janet Cummings and the DNA of Stephan Hough.
Mouth swab is taken from you. Okay? That swab is loaded onto the DNA database.
Stephan Hough's continual offending did put him at risk of eventually being arrested, certainly. But we shouldn't underestimate just how powerful the violent drive is within him, or how arrogant his thinking would have been about the likelihood of detection.
It just shows you that even killers who believe they've got away with it are more and more recognising that it's only a matter of time before they're caught.
As Janet's family and Hough were both living in Flint, this was a delicate operation.
My involvement with the family, I mean, I can only describe them as absolutely fantastic, hard-working family who supported North Wales Police all the way through the 2016 investigation.
40 years on, the community of Flint was thrust into the spotlight again as Janet's traumatic killing hit the headlines.
I think there was a little bit of disbelief in the town of Flint, really, that a local man could have done such a thing, where they believed for so long that a traveller was responsible, which I guess fitted into their mindset, really, of it not being a local person.
After 4 decades, police have 57-year-old Stephan Hough in custody and can start the detailed re-examination of the case. They were determined to make no mistakes.
The most important thing in any investigation is the continuity and integrity of evidence that's seized, exhibits, whether they be clothing, forensic exhibits, making sure that whoever handles that evidence is signing the exhibit labels, the continuity statements, and their subsequent integrity, the way the material is stored and preserved. It cannot be challenged.
He was taken to North Wales, where he was interviewed over a period of several days. He initially started to speak to the police. He was initially quite confident, because naturally we wouldn't disclose the strength of our forensic evidence from the off.
First of all, we'd like to talk to you about the murder of Janet Cummings in 1976. What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
He came across initially as quite a cocky person who would talk about anything and everything at that particular time.
He denied any involvement in Janet's killing, despite the fact that they presented him with the very compelling DNA evidence.
So she's been vaginally raped, anally raped, and during the course of that, she's also suffered suffocation around the face and neck. And certainly those injuries that I've specified to you indicate that. Okay? Now, taking into account all those injuries and the cause of death, Stephen, are you responsible for those injuries?
No comment.
It was disclosed to him that his semen had been found on Janet's trouser leg, and semen had been found on intimate samples taken from Janet as well, where he crossed his arms and went no comment to every question after that.
Mouth swab is taken from you. Okay? That swab is loaded onto the DNA database. That swab is a full hit on the semen cell stain from Janet Cummings' trousers in 1976. Now, if you fully understand what I'm saying, if you want me to explain it, I'll explain it to you.
Hough's DNA match proved that he was 1 billion times more likely to be Janet's killer than anybody else.
And that's when Stephan Hough probably on the advice of his solicitor. We don't know. But then he didn't talk to us anymore.
So, Stephen, please explain how your semen is on Janet Cummings' childhood.
No comment.
Is there any explanation you can give me at this time? Are you willing to give an explanation?
No comment.
Hough displayed no emotion, no remorse, no surprise to Donna Young's.
The dragging of the victim into the bushes and then attacking her while she's face down is very consistent with an animal attacking another animal in the wild. The humanity of the prey is utterly irrelevant.
The biggest obstacle that police and prosecutors faced was that, officially, this crime already had been successfully prosecuted. Patrick Harrington QC was charged with defending Hough.
The obvious and curious aspect to the preparation of this case was that at the time of the murder, a suspect had not only been arrested, but made what was on the face of it a complete and accurate confession as to what he said he had done. And when he got to court, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Janet Cummings.
We were now prosecuting someone 40 years later of a crime where someone stood convicted of that offence.
If someone else had been responsible for the death of Janet Cummings, how could Hough be guilty? Did he stand a realistic chance of avoiding conviction?
It was a unique case because Noel Jones stood convicted of that killing. So we knew that we had to get Noel Jones to give evidence at that prosecution of Stephan Hough to say, actually, this is what happened to me back then. This is why I signed a false confession. And this is me now.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
When under interrogation by police, Stephan Hough showed no signs of confessing.
Stephen, are you responsible?
No comment.
Building their case against Hough meant focusing on the scientific strides made in forensic investigation over 40 years and ensuring the facts from the night of the attack could be established. Pathologist Dr. Brian Rogers was asked to re-examine the original pathology report.
I first got involved with this case, which was a cold case back in 2016, when North Wales Police contacted me to see if I would be able to have a re-look at the forensic evidence.
It was not going to be straightforward.
The post-mortem was limited, and the photographs were quite limited of the post-mortem. They were also rather poor quality. They were only black and white. You couldn't see things clearly.
Step by step, the crime was revisited. From the head wound that Janet suffered, it seemed clear that her attacker was prepared to use catastrophic violence.
It looked like a blunt force impact. I mean, in theory, it could have been caused if her head's been pushed down onto a rock or a stone or something like that, or she could have been hit with something. If someone was struck with a bottle, it would produce a laceration of that type.
Using his stature violently was a Hough trademark. Rogers confirmed that Janet had been held face down with her neck compressed by someone's hands.
The whole picture of her death pointed to one of external airway occlusion, which is essentially this, for whatever mechanism, hand or face down, and neck compression. I mean, essentially, she was suffocated during this attack.
Then there were the new findings.
The vaginal and anal swabs were still on record, and a DNA match was subsequently made.
DNA has come on in leaps and bounds, even in the last couple of decades. Time was when you'd have to explain to a jury how the calculations are made about probabilities. Nowadays, juries are sufficiently familiar with DNA because it's on their radar, that once you tell them the DNA was there, they are perfectly prepared to accept that as being definitive.
The case against Hough was mounting. There were his other offences to be considered too.
His offending history had continued for 40 years, and his pattern of offending had continued, and clearly sexual offending was very prevalent within his offending history and offending cycle as well.
2016 and Stephan Hough is finally facing a day in court related to the rape and death of Janet Cummings. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Hough refused to admit his guilt.
He went to trial, denying the case, said he wasn't responsible.
He was remarkably relaxed. I wouldn't say calm, but he was certainly relaxed.
Hough's defence argued that there could have been a mishandling of the investigation in 1976.
We actually called as a witness for the defence the barrister who'd represented Noah Jones as the junior barrister at his case in 1976. And he was resolute in the evidence that he gave that there had been nothing about the confession made in the police interviews, supported by his confession by a guilty plea, that caused the barrister any concern at all.
Noel Jones, now married with children, was still at the centre of the case and had served 6 years for Janet's death. If Harrington could establish that Noel was guilty, how could Hough be guilty?
If we could establish, just on the basis that brought a query to the mind of the jury, that he may have been the killer, and having pleaded guilty, there was a strong presumption he was. If we could establish that, then by a process of elimination, it could not have been Stephan Hough.
We knew that we had to get Noel Jones to give evidence at that prosecution of Stephan Hough to say, actually, it wasn't me. Basically, the pressure I was put in by the police back then made me sign and say things that weren't true. And he gave really compelling evidence.
By denying his guilt, Hough himself was content to leave a stain over the character of the innocent Noel Jones.
There are two parts of Stephan Hough's personality, which meant he could sit back and watch an innocent man serve years in prison. The first is that he is a psychopath. He has no empathy. He has a purely strategic focus to his thinking. The second is he has an antisocial personality.
It was time for a jury to decide if Stephan Hough was a man made to kill.
The jury were asked to retire, having heard the evidence. But significantly in this case, and I think it's the only time it's happened in legal history, is that the judge gave two directions to the jury before they could convict Stephan Hough. They had to be sure, beyond reasonable doubt, that Noel Jones was not connected whatsoever to that murder before they could move on to the evidence against Stephan Hough, and to be sure again, beyond reasonable doubt, that he was, in fact, responsible for the killing. So there were two hurdles, if you like, for us to get over in that court case. But we got over them.
Hough was convicted of manslaughter, rape and buggery. For manslaughter, he got 12 years. For rape, he got 8 years. And for buggery, he got 8 years. But all those sentences were to run concurrently. In other words, at the same time. So the total sentence was just 12 years.
The people of Flint, still around from 1976, and Janet's family, finally had justice. To some, only of a sort.
What must be heartbreaking in this crime is that Janet Cummings' family never lost sight of their desire to bring the person who killed their child and their relative to justice. And what justice is there in a 12-year sentence for stealing a whole life?
I think the family are certainly a different family to what they were in 2016 when the investigation was taking place, in a better place. And I think they probably a bit more, relaxed and, content that the right person has been convicted of Janet's murder and that an innocent man has now been exonerated.
Hough was sentenced to 3 offences for sexually assaulting the 15-year-old girl in 2016. Because Noel Jones had been sent to prison for manslaughter, not murder, Hough, a minor at the time of the offence, benefited from the lesser charge.
He was naturally very relieved that he was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, with the consequences that brings. And I think he was simply looking forward, counting the days, to when his eventual release will come. Had he been convicted of murder, that would effectively mean that he would spend the rest of his life in prison, because he would have got a significant tariff for this offence. 15 years as an absolute minimum, probably rather longer than that.
In the judge's sentencing comments, he pointed out that Hough had been booted out of the army after being found guilty of assaulting yet another person. Clearly, that assault may never have happened if Hough had been arrested way back when in connection with Janet's killing.
In 1976, confused and vulnerable, Noel Jones had admitted to a crime that he did not commit.
It was only in 1982, when he was released, that he was able to rebuild his life. He changed his name so that he'd be anonymised, went on to marry, had some children, and it was only his family that he ever told about what happened to him.
Jones had never challenged his conviction, but after Stephan Hough was put behind bars and then aged 61, Noel decided to clear his name.
There was very little publicity about Noah Jones's acquittal in the Court of Appeal. Sir Brian Leveson heard the appeal, apparently with great sensitivity, and the appeal was allowed, as I say, without any resistance from the prosecution. And he is now unconvicted, acquitted of the crime to which he pleaded guilty 40 years ago.
Police finally got the man responsible for the death of Janet Cummins. The grim story of the crimes of Stephan Hough have spanned 4 decades.
I've prosecuted or defended in more than 250 homicide cases, but there are certainly some that stand out in your recollection, and this will be one. I'll never forget Stephan Hough.
Stephan Hough retains control of one thing, a precise confession as to what happened that night, leaving the family still wondering.
They deserve to know where Janet was killed. They deserve to know what the full circumstances of her death were. Because they weren't there, were they? And the only person that was there who knows is Stephen Anthony Hough, who so far hasn't told anybody what the circumstances are.
Karen Pedley was on duty at a West Cornwall nursing home the night it was gutted by fire.
Oh yeah, they were all in there acting the fool and laughing and dancing, and Karen was putting them to bed.
It was the curtains in that room that had been set alight, and the room itself was absolutely devastated. Both ladies in that room were hospitalised.
Fire kills, and fire kills horribly. In some respects, you're lucky if you die of smoke inhalation first.
One woman did die. How had the fire begun? This wasn't the first time that one of Karen Pedley's places of work had been struck by a suspicious blaze.
Fire seems to follow this girl around, and you'd really need to start thinking how and where and what else has happened in the past that we don't know about.
It would take years for investigators to link a string of arson attacks. And when they did, they would discover that Karen Pedley was once a hero, raising an alarm at her family home.
It was through responding to the fire that Karen got a taste of approval and of even existing, of having any identity of her own.
Hailed as a lifesaver, did that incident in Karen's childhood mean she was made for murder? What made Karen the schoolgirl, Karen the killer? Using expert digital imagery from a specialist forensic artist to show the changing faces of a killer, this series reveals the life timelines and the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life. It was at the age of 10 when Karen became the local hero. She saved her family from a house fire.
Karen discovered a fire that had begun in the airing cupboard at her family home. She alerted her parents. everyone was safely evacuated from the house.
She was praised and lauded in the local press for saving her family from a blaze that eventually gutted their house. She was awarded a trip on Concorde, featured in the local newspaper, and for a little while was really quite something.
Little Karen had saved the lives of her 6 brothers and sisters. Now infirm, one remembers how close she had been to losing her life.
Flames were coming out and I had to jump the flames to get out of the house. I was the last one out and we lost everything, absolutely everything in that house fire.
It was a big moment in the life of a little girl, one who may have felt that no one had taken very much notice of. Criminologist Jane Monckton-Smith and forensic psychologist Dr. Donna Youngs have been tracing the life and the crime of Karen Pedley.
6 siblings, struggling for attention in normal circumstances, but in this family, my sense is that she was barely identified as a separate human being.
It would have all been, very chaotic probably, and unless you've got quite dedicated, caring and skilled parents, children get very lost in that kind of atmosphere.
To any child, the amount of attention that Karen Pedley got for saving the day when this fire broke out in the family home would impact upon them. But to someone whose childhood, whose upbringing to this point was so psychologically barren, the impact on her and on who she became would have been absolutely enormous.
Some family members deny that Karen was not shown enough attention when a child, but they all agree that she was feted in the paper, praised in the local community, rewarded with a trip on Concorde. This was an extraordinary moment in Karen's otherwise ordinary existence, but it couldn't last.
The thing with these kinds of stories is they have a shelf life. They would only last maybe a couple of weeks at best, and Karen Pedley would have very, very quickly been thrown unceremoniously back into that life where she was probably, or felt like she was, nobody.
The impact of the episode was far longer lasting. Forensic psychologist Dr. Donna Youngs believes fire acquired a very special place in the heart of Karen Pedley.
Karen Pedley, within a family background where I think there's probably a real deficit of communication and a meaningful emotional communication, fire becomes her way of communicating with the outside world. It's her way of getting attention, it's her way of making a point, it's her way of striking out in revenge. It's her way of having an identity.
Shortly after their home was gutted by fire, the family relocated from Bedfordshire to Cornwall in England. Karen Stringer grew up and married, becoming Mrs. Karen Pedley.
She had children, and she found a number of casual work in the local Cornwall area.
In a large extended family, nephew Junior remembers Karen as his fun auntie.
She was a really caring auntie. She would take us out on a moped. Yeah, she was a bit reckless, but it was like she was safe at doing it. Like, she wouldn't put us in any danger. And if she knew something was going to happen, she'd make it stop before it did happen. Out of all the aunts and uncles that I had, my Auntie Karen was my favourite because she was there for us. She was really supportive.
But while Karen came across as happy and carefree, her life was far from rosy.
Karen Pedley did not have an easy life. She clearly struggled with many elements of life. She had a menial job. She couldn't even hold that down.
She seemed to have an uneven career, often getting fired from some pubs and places such as that.
In 2002, Karen Pedley got a job as a cleaner at the Trafula House nursing home in St. Day. Shortly after she started, a fire broke out. No one was hurt, and no one could work out how it had started. No arrests were made after a short investigation. In 2006, Karen and her family moved to the village of Carharrick. Curiously, the mysterious fires seemed to follow her.
She worked at a shop, a care home and a working men's club. And at some stage, all of those premises were set alight. It seemed if Karen got cross, fire would follow soon after.
On a number of occasions with these fires, they seem to relate to places where she'd left in some degree of acrimony, whether that's been fired or whatever. She was very often the person who called the fire brigade, and she was very often the first person on scene.
Karen lost her job at one care home when the manager found her asleep under a table during a night shift. A few days later, the home suffered an arson attack.
Some patterns started to build in Karen Pedley's life, and fire actually formed a big part of those patterns. In a lot of the jobs that she had, there would be fires afterwards, and especially it seems when maybe she'd left on bad terms. And it started to build a picture. Certainly for us looking back, we can see a picture of fire after fire after fire. But she seemed to be getting away with it at the time, and nobody was joining the dots.
It seemed that Karen Pedley had found a way of feeling in control in a life that was often chaotic.
I can see that somebody who must have felt so powerless, it's not surprising that somebody like that would be instinctively drawn to something as potent and something that has such a life of its own as fire.
Criminologist Dr. Jane Monckton-Smith believes playing this role was all part of the thrill for Karen Pedley.
This is a mania, this is a compulsion, this is something that is taking over her thoughts way too much of the time. And very, very often those people will want to be there once the fire is set. That is the glory moment for them. It's such a huge drama, and all because of them. They created it.
Nobody had been hurt so far because of the fires that Pedley had begun. She was not under suspicion, so she could get work in places where a fire might easily cause death, where people were vulnerable.
In 2008, she got a job at a care home in Cornwall, where, of course, elderly and vulnerable people lived. She was described as unassuming, somebody who just went about their work quietly.
The manager of the Rosewyne House care home is Jenny Spargo.
We were just like one big family. They were my family then. We also had flats which were for the people who were much more able, but they used to come into our place for lunch, and they'd come in for tea and come in and join with the activities, and then if they became poorly they could then move into the home, and it was just like basically one big happy family.
Rosewyne House felt safe to those who lived and worked there. Good enough for Jenny to put her own mum there.
My mother was there for 4.5 years. I also lived there, which meant I was there 24/7. So they obviously were more a family to me than anything else, really. So it was just the way I lived. It wasn't a job anymore. It was just my life.
Rosewyne for Jenny was a labour of love, but in the nursing home sector, recruitment is a well-known problem.
It's not easy to employ staff, and it's not always easy to employ like 20-old ladies as well, women or children, you know. It can be quite difficult sometimes.
It was in 2008 that Rosewyne House on Alverton Terrace in Truro got the call from Karen Pedley, looking for work. She had good references. There was no indication that she wouldn't be a useful addition to the team.
She came originally, I think, to be a cook or a cleaner, or she was going to be domestic side, but she did a bit of cooking, she did a bit of cleaning, but she could also do care as well. At the time, she seemed to fit in with everybody, and I didn't have any complaints from anybody, so no reason to think there was any problems, really.
She wasn't on a barred list. She didn't have convictions which meant that she would be recognised as someone who shouldn't be working with vulnerable people.
There were no red flags on Karen Pedley's employment record. Her troubling backstory was yet to be uncovered. The little girl who had grown to be the woman who played with fire was all set to be a threat and was not concerned who might get burnt.
On the day of the fire, I got up like normal, went to school, and the bell rang for school to finish, and it just felt normal, like we were waiting for our mum, and then we just got kept in the office, and then I think it was like an hour later my mum turned up and said that the house had been on fire.
In 2008, despite her checkered employment history, Karen Pedley was working at Roseman Residential Nursing Home in Truro. Before long, she was taking responsibility for the lives and well-being of the elderly residents.
As far as we know, had all the normal duties of a care assistant. And they're actually quite difficult, quite physical sometimes. So that would be maybe dealing with continence issues of patients, maybe turning them, making sure that they don't get sores, helping them to eat.
Nobody ever sort of came to me with complaints, but sometimes I didn't really see very much of her. She didn't work full-time all the time, so it was sort of a bit hit and miss, I suppose, with her, really.
There were no complaints about Karen, but she had a few concerns of her own. For one thing, she told how she was convinced that the nursing home was a fire risk.
During that time there, she had mentioned to her sister that she was really, really concerned about the state of some of the electrics in the residents' rooms. Seemed to be suggesting that they were a fire risk.
She kept whinging about it. She was saying about the electrics at the place. They could see the wire, you could see on the plug sockets were hanging out. The socket was off the wall, and you could see all the leads there. And there was a electric fire in one of the rooms. And you could see the wires in that. She said it was wrong, the way the place was. It needed redoing.
Was Karen Pedley being safety conscious, or was she laying the groundwork to return to her old tricks?
Greg, who was one of the owners, he used to do all the fire drills and the things like this. And she was always pestering him for more training and talking about fires, and she seemed to be wanting to know lots about the fire and where things were, and always wanted more fire exercises done and more information on fire training. And but he thought she was just interested, so actually told him how she'd rescued somebody, and this was down at the Seafarers at Falmouth, how she'd worked there and she'd rescued somebody from the home when it caught on fire.
In fact, while Karen was working at the Seafarers Hostel, fires had broken out in 3 of the elderly residents' rooms. In what appeared a fortuitous coincidence, Karen had been on hand to help rescue the vulnerable gentleman who lived there. Later, it would become clear she had started the fires. She needed to be seen as the hero.
It's whenever she feels particularly suppressed psychologically, when her self-esteem is particularly low, I think she's going to go back to what she knows. And for Karen Pedley, that's starting a fire. And what followed, what she assumes will always follow, is the esteem, is the approval, is the sense of mattering that I think is so missing in Karen's life.
2008 was the year that Karen Pedley took her risky game to the next level. On one chilly night in late November, things were peaceful at Roseman House.
Well, it had been a sort of normal day as far as I can remember. I'd been out in the evening and I'd come back into the home and my mother was there. So I went in every night and made sure she was in bed and she was okay.
On the 23rd of November, Mrs. Spargo went home. On her way out, she noticed that Karen was actually in one of the rooms with one of the residents and seemed to be having lots of fun dancing with them.
Those residents were 96-year-old Gladys Rowe and her roommate Olive Ray. Karen was with them in room 5, along with a co-worker called Catherine.
I'd seen Karen was with Catherine, putting Joan and Gladys to bed. They had music on and they were singing and laughing and playing around.
Jenny walked to her house just a few yards away on the same site as the nursing home.
I'd then gone over and got ready for bed, And within about 20-25 minutes, I had a phone call to say, can you come over here? There's a room on fire.
When Jennifer Spargo arrived at the nursing home, there was a scene of chaos. The elderly residents were being evacuated from their rooms. Now, she went straight up to room 5. There was smoke billowing out from there, and she just couldn't get in.
I tried to open the door, and I couldn't because the room was just black. And I would say in 48 years of care, it was the worst thing I've ever done. And it was just horrible. It was just a horrible, horrible night. So I just opened it slightly, and it was completely black. You couldn't see anything. You couldn't see a thing.
The fire had begun in room 5, the room of Gladys Rowe and Olive Ray, the room that Karen Pedley had been seen in by colleagues minutes before.
On the night of the fire in Rosewyn House, it was a point of comment that Karen Pedley seemed quite excitable, quite happy. She was jumping around and dancing with the residents, which wasn't her usual behaviour. But it kind of indicates that she was looking forward to something, thinking about it, and it was exciting her.
That something was her latest arson attack.
What Karen Pedley did here was to light a fire in the bedroom of somebody who was almost certainly, even if they were in good physical shape, not going to be able to escape because they were asleep at the time. By the time they woke, the fire could almost certainly have engulfed the room. Not only did she do that, but she actually chose to do so in the room of very, very vulnerable older people who were not going to be fit to run away. Arsonists, in my opinion, all show a deep lack of compassion, but this is taking it to another level.
The fire service were called. This was a big fire. This was a serious fire. And it didn't take the fire service very long to work out where the seat of that fire was. And they found that fire had been started in room 5.
Jenny Spargo was immediately suspicious about how the fire had started. Fire doors in the home were designed to close to stop fire spreading, but the one in room 5 had not closed.
The trouble is, because you've been so meticulous with what you do and with training and the fire regulations, you keep thinking there's got to be something more to this.
Could a careless smoker, one of the residents perhaps, have caused the fire?
Nobody smoked in their bedrooms. We had a smoking area because elderly people, I'm afraid, do smoke. In fact, some of them were very hairy smokers, but we only had a couple that smoked.
As Jenny struggled to solve the mystery, there was tragic news from the hospital. 5 days after the blaze, one of the women evacuated from room 5 died. 96-year-old Gladys Rowe.
Well, Gladys had been with us for 9 years. She was quite a character, you know. She was just a well-known person in Truro. And a lot of my grandchildren used to come up and they always used to go and talk to Gladys because Gladys would tell them tales about what happened years ago, which was, you know, really quite interesting. They loved it.
Gladys was still alive when she was rescued from room 5, but the damage to her lungs had been done. A small community was in shock. Then, to heap tragedy upon tragedy, Gladys's roommate Olive Ray died. Investigators did everything they could, but the cause of the fire remained a mystery.
From the very beginning, when it was found by the fire service that this was a suspicious fire, Karen Pedley tried to deflect the blame. She, not just away from herself, but on to another specific person.
We weren't allowed to go up there anymore. We weren't allowed to go in the room, and the dogs came up with the fire people to check for accelerants, and then they ripped up the floorboards and we had to wait, and they said they couldn't find anything at all whatsoever. So basically that night it was all speculation of what happened.
It seems that suspicion fell very, very quickly onto Karen. She was arrested but was released on bail, as this was going to be a real protracted inquiry.
Cases like this can be extremely difficult to investigate, especially if there's no forensic evidence and no independent witnesses.
Pedley was soon released. There was not enough evidence to lay a charge. And as time passed, to Jenny Spargo and the Truro community, it looked as though the investigation had ground to a halt.
You keep thinking there's got to be something more to this. And we had to go to the police and give statements and whatever. And then it all went quiet until I think it was 2 or 3 years later that they actually had the inquest.
This arson was quite difficult to prove for the police, but you know, they were working in the background.
But there would be no immediate breakthrough, so Karen's trail of death and destruction were far from over.
Pedley is clearly and utterly obsessed with starting fires. There are very few more dangerous types of people.
And her next targets would be her own family.
But that, like, my Auntie Karen was making jokes and everything, which wasn't the right moment to do anything like that.
No one linked the incidents of fire which Karen Pedley had caused throughout her life. As a 10-year-old, she'd been linked with a fire at her family home. As she became a young woman, she took jobs where fires would soon begin. After marriage, she'd set alight her sister's home, and in 2010, she struck again.
So a couple of years after the fire at the care home, Karen's sister experienced a fire that broke out under the stairs in her house.
Karen's sister, Jenny Stringer, lived with her children in a town called Hale in Cornwall, some 14 miles from Karen's home. Karen's nephew Junior remembers it well. He has good reason to.
On the day of the fire, I got up like normal, went to school, and the bell rang for school to finish. And it just felt normal, like we were waiting for our mum, and then we just got kept in the office. And then I think it was like an hour later, my mum turned up and said that the house had been on fire. And by the time we got back to the house, we had 3 fire engines and everything there. And they were still in the building at the time.
As the family began to process what had happened, an odd detail emerged. After Jenny had called the fire brigade, she called Karen.
She told me she was at home anyway. And literally within 5 minutes she was at my house.
And it was like my auntie lives like half an hour away, and she was there within 5 minutes, which we felt really strange.
It was certainly strange, and if detectives had known of her past, suspicion would very quickly have fallen on Karen Pedley.
Because arson is one step removed, that it can be very difficult to pick up arsonists, and that what detectives will regularly do is to look for somebody who was first on the scene, who was suspiciously helpful, who wants to insert themselves into any investigation. That certainly, in retrospect, appears to be the situation with Karen Pedley.
As the family considered what to do next, Karen appeared strangely elated.
My Auntie Karen was making jokes and everything. There was a bag of crisps on the floor, and she went, "Does anyone want any smoky bacon crisps?" Which wasn't the right moment to do anything like that. I was crying my eyes out. I got told we weren't allowed to go in the building. But I went, no, it's my house at the end of the day.
It was Karen who was there to pick up the pieces after this fire and to offer her sister and her sister's children help in getting them somewhere to stay.
So we stayed at my Auntie Karen's in Carharrick for, I think it was like 3 months.
It's like a compulsion with her. She's got to do it. It's just filling her mind most of the time. And Karen, you know, very generously allows her sister to come and live with her, and again becomes a little bit of a hero in the situation.
This is remarkably similar, where she becomes then the hero after a fire. We can trace this right back to 1983.
By 2010, on at least 7 occasions when there had been an unexplained fire, Karen Pedley had been on hand to save the day or had recently been in the building. The fatal fire at Roseman House did not stop her.
Even after this blaze, where Karen Pedley is a suspect and she knows she's a suspect, she's not in custody. There's no evidence against her at this stage, but she doesn't stop setting fires.
It was now that Karen's close family witnessed her playing the knight in shining armour.
The pattern seemed to be, and wherever Karen Pedley was, there was a fire. And not only was she there, she was always the one who would call the police. She would be there at the scene, watching the catastrophe of her work, probably reliving some of that glory that she felt that time when she was 10 years old, when she became a hero and she got all of that attention.
Given the lack, I think, of any other meaningful emotional life, I think the moment the incident happened and all the approval and the media attention that followed happened, I think it was very likely that Karen Pedley was going to, whenever things went wrong when she's older, try and reenact this situation.
For 8 years, from 2002 to 2010, no one suspected Karen Pedley, who continued to act like a supportive, caring auntie.
That's the kind of person she was. Like, she would do anything for her family, and she wouldn't let us down.
Later that year, firefighters attended a house blaze in the village of Carharrick, just 2 minutes from where Karen Pedley lived. It was the 8th fire that would eventually be linked to Pedley. She'd already caused 1 death, and it seemed nothing would stop her before she struck again.
Karen Pedley clearly had no empathy for other people. She had no feeling for anybody except herself. This is a woman who had children and who, despite that, was prepared to set fires which are always going to carry a risk of her being convicted. She had no thought for the impact that her conviction and notoriety might have on her own family.
To bring Karen Pedley to justice, something had to happen for detectives to build a case. Jenny Spargo had never been satisfied that the blaze at Roseman House had been an accident. For 2 years, she, her boss Greg, and their colleagues had been asking questions and forming theories.
I suppose, to be honest, my suspicions were Karen. One of my staff had a friend who worked in another home, and apparently she'd worked there and there'd been a fire there as well. And I think this is what sort of put us, thinking, no, there's more to this. And then we put together that she'd mentioned about the seafarers as well, so that was another problem. So we just had to go with our gut instinct, I suppose.
Instinct told them that Karen Pedley had something to do with it, not least because the day after the fire, she had walked out of the care home and simply never returned. She failed to turn up for her next shift.
In the end, Greg actually spent 2.5 years pushing the police and pushing and pushing and pushing. And that's what he did basically for 2.5 years.
In 2012, detectives made a breakthrough. After a tip-off, they were granted a warrant to search Karen Pedley's home. What they found was eye-opening.
They searched her house and they found a scrapbook full of newspaper clippings from that incident back in 1983 when she supposedly saved her family.
For 3 decades, Karen had treasured the memory of 1983 when, for a few short weeks, she'd been a hero.
When everybody is applauding you, everyone's congratulating you, all eyes are upon you, you are not going to forget that moment.
It was through responding to the fire that Karen got a taste of approval and of even existing, of having any identity of her own. I think it's not surprising that when anybody tries to push her down, keep her down, when anything goes wrong in her life, she tries to recreate these conditions.
Had detectives found a motive for Karen Pedley to start fires, one of which had claimed a life? The discovery of the scrapbook kick-started the investigation once again.
Then further inquiries into her background, her places that she lived, and her places of work They've started to find a pattern of fires happening wherever Karen Pedley happened to be. At this stage, alarm bells are going to start ringing. Fire seems to follow this girl around, and you'd really need to start thinking how and where and what else has happened in the past that we don't know about.
Investigators had now uncovered the pattern of suspicious blazes starting at places with links to Karen Pedley. But as she continued to set fires, could they prove it and stop her before there was another tragedy? And what part would her family play in her plan to avoid detection?
To be truthful, I didn't think it had anything to do with my auntie. And it was like, you read everything and it just comes out that she was the only one working on that day.
In 2013, Karen Pedley may have felt nervous. Police were investigating at least 12 suspicious fires across West Cornwall, and by then she was their number one suspect for causing the death of an elderly lady at Rosewind Care Home.
There's clear evidence she made real efforts to cover her tracks and try and take suspicion away from herself.
Pedley felt she needed the family's help.
My mum had a phone call from the police to say that my Auntie Karen wants her to make a statement to say that she was that my mum was with her when there was a care home fire. And my mum said no.
As detectives kept digging, they discovered that in the wake of one arson attack, Karen had forced a co-worker to back up her alibi.
From the very beginning, when it was found by the fire service that this was a suspicious fire, Karen Pedley tried to deflect the blame. She, not just away from herself, but on to another specific person. And she became very, very difficult to deal with over this, and she became threatening. She even threatened this other person that she was going to burn their house down, which seems a very strange thing to do when you have been perhaps put under suspicion of arson.
Originally, a co-worker didn't tell the truth to the police. But a short while later, her conscience got the better of her, and she finally told the truth. And that truth was that Karen Pedley had threatened her.
It was then that investigators learned that Pedley was often the first person to report the fires and would be present when firefighters arrived at the scene, offering her suggestions about how the blazes could have begun. The net began to close in, but building a case would be tough.
Now, this is a case investigating historic crimes like this, where you may not have any huge, great big bits of evidence. This is what we call similar fact evidence. We'll try and present the evidence that Karen Pedley, in a number of occasions, in almost identical situations, had set a fire or been close to where a fire was set, had been the one to call the police.
In February 2015, now living 400 miles away in Newcastle upon Tyne, Karen Pedley was arrested. Her nephew, Junior Stringer, couldn't believe the claims.
Didn't think it had anything to do with my auntie. And it was like, you read everything and it just comes out that she was the only one working on that day. And it was like the night when the fire happened, and like you just try and think, well, no, it's got nothing to do with my family.
Charged with almost a dozen arsons dating back to 2002, the attempted murder of Olive Wren and the murder of Gladys Rowe, Karen Pedley was remanded in custody. Even in jail, her urge to start fires was too strong to ignore.
She sets fire to her own cell. I mean, this compulsion that she has, she doesn't seem to realise how it's constantly pointing the finger back at her, that she is actually guilty of all these fires.
When the case came to court, there seemed to be a significant amount of evidence against her. There seemed to be all the similar facts around all the number of fires that we believe total about 14. Obviously, the worst of these was the one where, unfortunately, Gladys passed away as a direct result of that, and the jury convicted her.
It was a moment of truth for Karen Pedley's family.
She tried denying it all the way through her life, and it's like we found out that she'd done that many fires, and we just couldn't believe her anymore.
The realisation that it was Auntie Karen who'd taken everything from him as a child hit Junior even harder.
So when I found out that she set the fire in my home, I was really shocked. because she denied all the fires she'd done, but it was when she went to court and she admitted to the one that she'd done in my home. That was it. We had nothing more to do with the family. We didn't want anything to do with them.
A psychiatrist report found that Karen to be of low intelligence with a personality disorder. Junior Stringer wonders if her actions all go back to the event that had defined her childhood.
I have wondered why so many times, but to be truthful, I don't think I'll ever have an answer for why she wanted to do that. So I think she's had it where if she sets a fire and then she'll save everyone.
It seems to me that Karen Pedley wanted to be the hero of the day. We can trace that back to 1983, and it shows up again when she magically appears on scene when her sister's house is on fire. I think it made her feel good about herself.
In fact, at Pedley's trial there was speculation about the origins of that devastating blaze in Karen's childhood home. She had been thought a hero, but was she actually the villain of the piece?
To this day, we still don't know whether it was her, but hearing from the judge, he was the one who was saying that it could possibly be her, because that's where she's got it from, where if she saves someone, she'll get a reward, and she got the reward of going on the Concorde.
I think it's possible that she did set the fire, but I don't think at this stage that she was an arsonist. I think she may have, as many children do, simply have been playing with matches.
It wasn't the fire itself, but rather how her actions were received that fed Karen's pyromania as she grew.
When you have the complete deprivation of attention and the complete deprivation of any understanding of right and wrong, it produces what can almost be likened to an almost feral child. A child almost raised in the wild. Now, a feral child who will do almost anything to survive is an absolute blank page, is absolutely primed for any salient, any strong psychological episodes, any definitive episodes, such as what happened purely possibly by chance in Karen Pedley's life with the fire and her coming across a fire in her family home. On such a blank page, on such a psychologically empty landscape, this would have enormously impacted her.
Karen Pedley had become a woman made for murder, not through her desire to see people die, but by failing to connect fire with lethal danger.
I really don't think that she would have been deliberately using fire, particularly in the early days, to harm other human beings. I think it was a statement, an outburst, a reaction, rather than a premeditated attempt at murder in the early days.
Fire was her obsession. Indeed, sentencing Pedley, the judge expressed astonishment that she had continued to start fires even after the death of Gladys Rowe.
Karen Pedley felt compelled to keep setting fires. Gladys Rowe's death would not have ended that compulsion. To put it very, very bluntly, Gladys Rowe was collateral damage in her wider campaign of arson. I don't think she really probably cared that much, if at all, that somebody had died. It may have added to the drama.
I would view Karen Pedley as being a risk for the rest of her life. She uses fire as a weapon. I think she feels fire gives her an enormous sense of power.
Had Pedley's early years contributed to a state of mind where she simply didn't have a sense of right and wrong, where she didn't feel enough empathy to stop her committing harm?
I don't think she's ever mattered to anybody particularly. So when you have that kind of upbringing, then other people do not have the same significance that they do to you or I. And I think that's what we're seeing here, that although she had quite friendly relationships with the old people that she was caring for and knew them, and we know that she danced with them and played with them, ultimately her need for esteem, her need to matter, her need to feel this sense of significance again would override any other human emotions.
Karen Pedley was jailed for a minimum of 27 years for the murder of 96-year-old Gladys Rowe, who was fatally injured in the fire at Rosewyne House in November 2008. She was further given 14 life sentences for her numerous acts of arson. She was found not guilty of the attempted murder of Olive Ray. Karen Pedley, a child who became a hero, an employee who took out her grudges by setting ablaze those places where she had lost jobs, an aunt and sister who played the Good Samaritan after she herself had set another house on fire. She had become a woman who played with fire, and in the process was made for murder.
It was inevitable that at some stage her carelessness with human life would end in somebody being killed.
On a remote Scottish road, a car crashes. Minutes later, the vehicle explodes, killing 32-year-old passenger Claire Morris. She had much to look forward to. Just a year earlier, Claire and the driver, Malcolm Webster, had been married in a lavish ceremony.
This was the first person that she'd fallen in love with.
It seemed like a perfect match, but detectives would uncover much about Webster that Claire didn't know.
He groomed women through sympathy in relation to apparent terminal illnesses such as leukemia.
For over a decade, Malcolm Webster would be at the heart of the mystery. Was Claire's death a tragic accident, or had she been killed by a man made for murder?
Long before Malcolm Webster met Claire Morris, I think he was a murderer in preparation.
What made policeman's son Malcolm Webster the killer he became? Using expert digital imagery from a specialist forensic artist to show the changing faces of a killer, this series reveals the life, timelines and the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life.
Even from a very young age, Malcolm Webster was setting fire to everything he seemed to be able to get hold of. It is a worrying sign. It's telling us that there's something going wrong in the way he's thinking, in the way he's relating within his family already.
Malcolm Webster was a problem child, a fact which might surprise given his dad's job. He worked at the Metropolitan Police.
His father wasn't just a hugely successful man, he was head of the fraud squad, and that's a very particular type of professional perspective on things.
Dr. Donna Youngs is a forensic psychologist, a relatively new science which reveals the red flags in a person's life, the ones which suggest they could become a killer.
There was something different about Malcolm Webster's father and something different in the way he got treated.
And if we looked at his life as a timeline, there are so many incidents of fire that Webster was involved in.
That behaviour is very unusual in a child and something that we would certainly consider to be a red flag for the future.
So on scout trips, things had gone on fire and Webster was never far away. And that nickname he had, which there's a certain irony in, and the nickname was Pyro.
He would brag about his skill in setting fires, and he would set fire to things. And it is said that he did that to get attention and perhaps to try and make friends.
Was Malcolm Webster already developing traits that would lead him to kill?
We know that many murderers practice first. They may progress from fairly small crimes to fairly big ones.
As the younger of a pair of twins, Malcolm was forced to find ways to grab the limelight.
He was known to be attention-seeking. He always wanted attention, but he always seemed to want to get his own way as well.
One way he discovered he could get sympathy was by feigning illness.
He'd feigned the fact that he had a brain tumour, a life-threatening illness.
He would pretend to faint, and that probably got him the attention that he was craving at the time.
He had, firstly, had a lot of medical conditions which apparently miraculously disappeared, and no question, faked medical illnesses for his own ends.
Certainly, by the time he was around 17 years old, he was making up quite elaborate lies about his health. He had joined an amateur dramatic group, and the people in the group were convinced that he had a brain tumour, and he would often faint and become ill.
Leaving school without qualifications, Webster still had to find a path for himself in the grown-up world.
He decided at that time that he wanted to become a nurse, which isn't that surprising. His mum had been a nurse, but also there was the involvement with illness and drugs and the attention that he got from that.
I do think it's relevant that Malcolm Webster chooses to follow in his mother's footsteps. It tells us that he is seeking parental approval, but he realises he can't even begin to match up to his father, and so he doesn't even try.
Malcolm Webster, by his 20s, did have a winning way.
He was a charmer. He was a quintessential English gentleman.
Malcolm Webster makes a decision, possibly not a conscious one, to become the complete opposite of everything that his father is. And that means somebody who is very engaging, very charismatic, very interpersonally aware and presents himself very well. Now, this will have charmed many people, and we know it did.
By the early 90s, Webster was working in the Middle East.
By the time he's around 30 years old, he's left the UK and he's living and working in Abu Dhabi. And he's working, certainly in a nursing role, in a children's hospital. But things went very wrong for him there.
It was around now that Webster became associated with unsolved mysteries. Tragedy seemed to follow him.
There were 3 unexplained deaths of children under 6 years old in strange circumstances where he had been on duty every single time. And he was immediately asked to leave the hospital and was in fact escorted from the country. That's another big red flag.
Webster found himself back in the UK, but out of a job. He set about job hunting, but as he did so, nobody had the complete picture of nurse Malcolm Webster.
There are lots of things in there that in hindsight, maybe you'd look back and you think, though, that's strange. You know, we've got the fire setting and we've got the fake illnesses, and we've also now got this really quite serious suspicion about him in the hospital.
A suspicion which remained unspoken, unreported. So Webster managed to talk his way into a nursing job at a hospital in Guildford.
Here he is, a man who has developed a lot of interpersonal charm. What's he going to do? He's going to use those particular skills to try and achieve in a way that equates to the success of his father somehow, but he can't do it in the same way. So the way he has to do it is in underhand manipulation, using his charm.
One of those who would fall for his charms was Claire Morris, who Malcolm had met at a party in 1990. Claire's brother is Peter.
My first impressions of him was quite gregarious, quite a pleasant chap. Claire described him as a little bit roguish, but he seemed okay to me. Seemed fine. Claire was a nurse. She'd been a nurse for some years. She'd done all training in London and what have you. And she was up in Dulwich. She was sharing a house in Dulwich with some friends. And I believe that she met Malcolm at a party, after which the next day he came down and was showering her with flowers and gifts and what have you. and he seemed a gentleman. He seemed the sort of person that Claire would be interested in, and it didn't take long for her to fall for him.
Malcolm and Claire formed quite a strong relationship together. He was clearly able to convince people that he was a nice person, a person that they wanted to spend time with. But I don't think that stretched to people outside of the relationship. And this is quite common with people like Malcolm Webster. They can be incredibly manipulative, especially when they focus on something that they want. Whether they can keep that manipulation up with other members in the family is more questionable.
He'd managed to sort of wind this spell over her, really. She was almost submissive to him, which was very un-Claire-like. And some other members of the family, some uncles and aunts and people, found him a bit, I think they described him as too good to be true.
He was, but Claire Morris knew nothing of his fake illnesses, fascination with starting fires, and the facts of what had happened on wards that he had worked on in the Middle East. Right now, the self-styled victim, Malcolm Webster, wanted most to be in total control of Claire Morris, and he knew how to do it.
He'd started drugging her the day before the wedding.
Malcolm Webster, almost as soon as he had met her, began to manipulate and control Claire. He wanted her money.
About 2 years in, he gets Claire to change her will, and he is the sole beneficiary. He gets absolutely everything.
And then there were the life insurance policies.
And we see during that time, Claire had 10 life insurance policies against her life and a big mortgage protection policy.
And that was even before the big day. It was in 1993, a year after the insurance policies were taken out, when the couple were married.
It was a very happy wedding. Met some family members I hadn't seen for years, as you do at these things. But it was a traditional Scottish wedding, had a bit of class to it.
And he managed to convince Claire that they could start a life together in Aberdeen. But of course what that would have done as well is isolate her from her support networks and her family. And being clearly the kind of controlling person that he was, that would have pleased him greatly. He may even have planned it that way.
Pan. She's got a microphone on. Oh, earthquake.
She was very fond of Scotland and that sort of environment, so it was no surprise. And the thought that she was being whisked away to a remote area didn't occur to me at all. She was with a man she loved, she was in an environment that she loved, and she was doing something that she loved.
And doing it a long way from her family and support network, Webster had her at his mercy. Oblivious to Webster's plotting, Claire remained devoted to her husband. He, meanwhile, was using his skills as a nurse to malevolent effect.
He'd started drugging her the day before the wedding.
During his nursing training, he would undoubtedly have learnt about the doses of different drugs, and of course he would also have learnt about the risks and the side effects. That's very calculating.
I think she knew there was something wrong, but she wasn't suspecting that she'd been sedated.
He was ready, willing and able to murder. Claire Morris's fate was in the hands of a man she knew truly little about. Superficially charming, but with a past involving pyromania and feigning life-threatening illnesses. A man she had signed over all of her money to.
The plan that Malcolm Webster puts in place is very elaborate, very detailed.
A plan which, to the well-being of his new wife, was fatal.
I found it absolutely astonishing that he was putting an act on. I mean, it was so utterly convincing, the performance.
1994, and Malcolm Webster, apparently devoted to Claire Morris, is in fact secretly sedating her. on a daily basis.
Clearly, she knew herself that there was something wrong within her, and Malcolm, he would sideline that and he would minimise it.
This is a classic case of, I suppose, gaslighting, making people believe that they are going mad. Of course, in the past, it would have been done by telling them they'd imagined things. But here we're seeing somebody who believes that she's becoming iller and iller and iller and isn't capable. She's tired, she's confused, she's forgetting things.
At the end of May 1994, Webster had decided that he was going to kill Claire. He gave her sedatives until she was unconscious, and then he carried her to the car, put the seat down so that as he was driving, nobody would be able to see that she was in the car.
He had found a site where he could drive the car into a tree, and he deliberately increased the dose of medication that he gave her in order to render her unconscious.
As it had been since he was a child, fire was to be his weapon of choice. Webster loaded cans of petrol into the boot.
So Claire's unconscious in the car. He goes to a fairly remote area and drives the car off the road, across the field and into a tree. He then gets out of the car, leaving Claire inside, unconscious, and sets fire to it. And of course, with the petrol in the bag, it's going to go up quite quickly.
He then proceeded to ensure that his new wife was burnt alive. If she was very lucky, she may have stayed unconscious as a result of those drugs. If she was not, then she died in agony.
When the emergency services arrived, Webster simply said that there was no one else in the car when it crashed. That lie was quickly exposed.
Some wonderful fireman had to do his best to get what was left of her up and into an ambulance. It's vile. And for that to happen to such a lovely person is just ridiculous. It's just vile.
Basically, what we had was a man who had planned this quite well. He decided he was going to stage a road traffic collision and effectively set the vehicle on fire with his wife in the passenger seat incapacitated and effectively burn her to death.
He gives a statement to the police the day after and seems to change his mind that, Claire was actually in the car. Maybe they thought that he was in shock when the car was in flames at the side of the road, but nobody asked any questions, and it certainly seemed at that time as he got away with it.
With Claire dead and nobody asking awkward questions, Webster cleaned up on the life insurance policies.
I think for Malcolm Webster, the money represents success, and it's a way that he can benchmark himself against his father, even now, even as an adult. It's a way of proving that he's as successful as his father.
The lying continued in a display of supposed grief at Claire's funeral.
Apparently he hadn't wanted to discuss the funeral, but I didn't know about that. And we went up to the funeral and he was sitting there in a big neck brace. And I think I put my arm on his shoulder, sort of in a comforting way and what have you, and he was just head down and all this sort of thing, looking very morose.
But it was all an act, the work of a consummate actor.
After Claire's death, this was supposed to be earth-shattering for him. In May of 1994, by the September, he had 2 other girlfriends. Apparently one was the daughter of the person who was doing the autopsy. So he was using that as access to find out what they'd found.
When satisfied he was in the clear, Webster felt confident to use the life insurance money and the proceeds of Claire's will. He bought himself a boat and sailed off into the sunset. To be precise, New Zealand.
Now I think it's fascinating that we know that Webster actually sails himself to the other side of the world. It shows me very clearly that we've got somebody who, again, is out of touch with reality, is simply living out these particular stories, and here he is putting himself across the other side of the world to start another one.
having accumulated significant wealth and benefited from Claire's death to the sum of well over £200,000, which in the 90s was a significant, this remains a significant amount of money, but he managed to squander that very, very quickly. So within 6 months of Claire's death, he found himself in a situation where he was pretty much empty in the bank, and so he was in this cycle of financial need, and he had a lavish lifestyle. He liked the good things in life, vehicles, the yachts, the whole package. So he was a man who was living well beyond his means.
Faced with being poor, Webster decided to get rich quick, making money through murder.
And he starts another relationship with another woman called Felicity Drum.
The fact that he had sufficient confidence in his own skin to go and effectively repeat what he did with Claire.
We know that this man not only was not horrified by what he'd done, but actually figured it worked so well and he'd got away with it that he would try it again when he needed a bit more cash.
It was a perfect plan from its inception through execution. He got away with it, so why wouldn't he do the same again?
What sort of a man had Webster, as he approached his 40th birthday, become?
We're not dealing with somebody here who buys into any of the normal moral standards or even any of the normal social accepted codes of conduct that we see with many and most violent criminals even. We're dealing with somebody who long ago gave up on trying to compete within the normal context of life. He just couldn't compete as a child. So he threw every accepted code of conduct out the window. He only has his own code of conduct.
One which made him ready to murder again. Soon after their marriage, unsuspecting Felicity began feeling unwell.
Clearly, even in the very, very early stages of their relationship, he was putting his plan into action.
In the relationship with Felicity, he starts to repeat the pattern, almost exactly the relationship that he had with Claire. He starts giving drugs to Felicity. She starts feeling again vulnerable and tired and fatigued. Not only was he drugging her, the pattern of him getting Claire to take out multiple life insurance policies, he also did the same with Felicity, and he got her to change her will in his favour.
Less than a year after they met, they were married. Within hours of exchanging vows, Webster steered his plan towards another killer car crash.
Practically the first day after they got married, he gave her such a huge dose of sedative that she slept for 36 hours. That's an incredibly dangerous thing to do in itself.
She lost something like 36 hours of the honeymoon that she slept through.
But Webster didn't care. He didn't care about Felicity. He certainly didn't care about her family. He didn't even care about the child she was carrying.
During the period that he was drugging Felicity, she was actually pregnant, and he knew that, and he was still giving her the drugs. He had no care at all for her or for his own unborn child.
It was 1999. Seeking an insurance payout even before killing Felicity, Webster returns to his childhood modus operandi of causing harm.
On more than one occasion, almost certainly, during his marriage to Felicity Dunn, he had set fire or had laid fires. On one occasion, with his infant son and his wife and her parents, all asleep in the same house.
I think that he presumed that because he was going to do this in a remote area of New Zealand, that nobody would collate that to an accident that happened in Scotland. And he got Felicity insured for best part of $1 million, and he was going to gain quite financially.
In the New Zealand version of events, Webster was forced to improvise. He'd been raiding his second wife's bank account.
They were going to the bank, they were going to meet with their solicitors. And that was going to unveil the fact that he had no money in the account. He had embezzled money from her account. So he knew that that was not going to be a good meeting. So he was pretty much forced into that journey being the journey where he had to do this. So it wasn't so controlled, it wasn't the perfect murder, because he was never a suspect, because there was never a crime.
Auckland, and a failed attempt by Malcolm Webster to kill Felicity Drum.
The police came upon them, and he was stopped.
He maintained that the accident had been caused because the steering had been faulty. But of course the vehicle examination had uncovered that that wasn't the case.
Car crash investigator Mark Crouch has analysed the accident.
Webster's allegation in the second collision was that there was a defect with the steering that caused him to swerve across the road. It's highly unusual for a defect to the steering to cause a vehicle to veer violently across the road.
The petrol cans were found in the rear of the vehicle by Felicity's brother-in-law. There was a cigarette lighter found in the console of the vehicle, which was odd because neither of them smoked. There were scrunched up newspapers, and all of this led them to think that something really suspicious had happened.
They became very suspicious all of a sudden. Things weren't sitting right.
That vehicle was examined and there were no defects found with it. Furthermore, the defect that would have been present to explain the scenario as per his account would have been very obvious to find, and it would have been very, very prevalent, except there wasn't a defect found.
That was a pretty compelling and poorly executed attempt on Felicity's life.
Felicity started putting the pieces of the jigsaw together and started to make sense of some of the things that had been happening to her. The family and Felicity started looking at some of the financial transactions that had been going on, and it came to light that there were forged insurance policies. There had been money moving around that she knew nothing about, and such were their suspicions at that point that Felicity decided to go to the police,
where she revealed details of the crash, the stolen money, and something else.
So she made a statement to the police about her suspicions, and she included in that she hadn't been feeling well. So they tested her hair, and as a result of those tests, they found out that she had been drugged for quite a long period of time.
The police in New Zealand had warrants issued in relation to his behaviour, so yes, he was absolutely on their radar in New Zealand. They were very clear in terms of their investigation that the prosecution were satisfied that there was sufficient evidence for an attempted murder in relation to his actions, and indeed the drugging of Felicity when she was pregnant.
The net was tightening on Malcolm Webster. He was left with only one option: to again run away.
I think Webster was very aware that Felicity was suspicious of him.
Once the House of Cards began to tumble in New Zealand and he realised that the game was up, he had to get out of there.
And by the time the police issued the arrest warrants, he'd already left the country and come back to the UK.
He'd got away with it once and escaped the law at his second attempt. Would he try again? In August 2004, Webster, still technically married to Felicity Drum, started a relationship with a woman called Simone Banerjee.
And the pattern started to repeat itself all over again.
Why did he feel the need to return to marriage in order to murder?
Malcolm Webster sees himself as the victim of lifelong circumstances. So whenever any possible opportunity presents itself to him, he sees no reason not to exploit that. He won't have seen what he's doing in terms of the harm, the violence, the murder that he's committing. He will simply have been seeing it in terms of the extent to which it feeds himself.
Malcolm Webster had killed his first wife, almost murdered his second, and was now back in the UK on the hunt for a new target.
The effectively went into phase 3 of his life, if you like. It wouldn't be too difficult to draw some conclusions, potentially, of what was going to be the outcome.
He made promises to marry her, he wanted to be in this committed relationship with her, but he failed to mention that he was still married to Felicity. He had not gone through divorce proceedings with her.
In his third potential victim, we see a woman who was unaware that he was not yet free to marry again, and he tried to persuade her to write a last will and testament without having to go through the bother of marrying her, leaving everything to him.
Recalling his childhood tendency to fake illnesses, Webster lied to Simone. He said that he had terminal cancer.
We know that he groomed women through sympathy in relation to apparent terminal illnesses such as leukemia. And in fact, he went to the extent of apparently going for chemotherapy, and in absence from the family home, he was actually engaging with other women, but he would return home with his head shaven, his eyebrows shaven, apparently as part of his chemotherapy.
He made himself lose an awful lot of weight, and this was all a big manipulation to, one, get her to feel sympathy for him so that she would stay in this relationship with him, but it also allowed him to have an excuse, if you like, to start asking her for money.
He was driven by a personality which prepared Malcolm Webster to do what it took to get his way.
Anything to get some kind of attention. These people do not care in the way that other people care about social rules, and they don't care about other people because they just don't have the emotional wherewithal to care about other people because everything is focused on themselves.
He even managed to convince Simone to change her will, again, in his favour, should she die before him.
He'd succeeded before, would he do so again? But then, a remarkable chance meeting sparked a new line of inquiry.
The decision in 2008 to actually re-energise the investigation was largely down to the chance visit in England between Felicity's sister and the police officer.
Felicity's sister, Jane, was in the UK for a conference about domestic abuse. She happened to tell a CID officer the story of the attempted killing in Auckland, and that she believed Webster was now in Scotland.
What Jane wanted to do while she was in the UK was seek out Webster and confront him. She was angry with him. This was there'd been no justice at all, and she wanted to go and she wanted to confront him. The police advised her against that, and I think at that point is when they decided that they were going to do some digging, they were going to do some investigating, and they took a statement from Jane.
So the coming together of the sister and the police officer in England was fortuitous. Thankfully, the police officer was sufficiently convinced about the account to contact Grampian Police in Scotland.
Scottish police, now suspicious about the death of Claire Morris, wrote a letter to warn Simone.
When it became known that they were about to embark on a fairly lengthy yacht trip around the Canaries, that's when the decision was taken that something had to be done, and so there was an intervention through what we call an Osman warning, where if the police become aware of intelligence that they believe that someone's life is in danger, then you're obliged to advise and notify that individual. Simone was warned that there was a genuine belief that she was in a relationship with a dangerous individual who had a history that would suggest that she needed to think very carefully about continuing that relationship.
Simultaneously, police launched an investigation into the death of Claire Morris.
Malcolm Webster's story really started to unravel.
2009 in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, and police get ready to make their move against Malcolm Webster. They trawl through his past, decide that a review of the death of his first wife, Claire Morris, was vital. Amongst others, they interview his former in-laws.
It's pretty earth-shattering because in 1994, when Claire died, one of my ways of coming to terms with it was that it was an accident, first and foremost, and Claire unluckily was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there was an air of fate about it. Suddenly all this turns up and I've got to accept that it wasn't actually fate. It could well have been avoided. It was a deliberate setup. And it starts making you wonder whether white is black or something like that. You know, I went through a period where I really didn't trust anybody with anything. You know, it was took a long time to come to terms with.
The circumstances of the road traffic accident involving Claire were remarkable, and the circumstances in New Zealand involving the road traffic accident with Felicity were remarkable, but when you overlaid and put the two together, they were compellingly striking in terms of the similarities. And so that largely was the catalyst for another wave of investigation.
But suspicions and remarkable coincidences were not enough to win a conviction for murder.
It needed more than that. It needed something tangible, something solid.
Science became crucial.
They had kept some tissue samples from the first accident.
The pathologist, Dr. James Grieve, he did have a meticulous record of what had happened in the original post-mortem. And had he not had the foresight to gather these samples and retain them over the years, then there wouldn't have been that piece of evidence that was the catalyst to ignite the second wave of police investigation. And that was a bombshell.
The sliver of tissue from Claire's crash revealed high levels of sedative in her body.
With the passage of time and the advance of science, the toxicology around that was remarkable.
We're talking about a thousandth of a gram, tiny piece. And they found a way of dividing that and testing it for unnatural substances. And that with this new method they invented to try it, they found temazepam in that sample, and that it was a 90-something% chance that it was temazepam. And that is not something that could be naturally in there from the body generating it. It would have to be planted there.
There was indeed scientific evidence that there was sedative in that liver tissue, which then, of course, entirely changed the circumstances of the original road traffic collision.
Lots of people consider car crashes to be accidents, just another thing that happens. But in the case of a very serious collision, where somebody has lost their life, they get looked at, murder scene or any other case where somebody gets very significantly injured. Collision investigation is a forensic science, and sometimes people forget that.
Webster claimed the car had swerved off the road and hit a tree before catching fire.
He said that he'd swerved to avoid a motorcycle.
But the speed of impact told a different story.
You would expect the vehicle to lose control at or about the speed limit for the road. It doesn't lose a lot of speed in the time that it's leaving those curve marks as it's travelling across the road and eventually into the thing that it hits. So it would be slightly unusual to end up with quite a low speed impact at the end of a swerve or an evasive manoeuvre.
Investigators concluded that the car was driving too slowly to have caused Claire's death and the subsequent fire.
Cars catching fire as a result of a collision are a bit of a rarity. It's more Hollywood than real world. There were witnesses that described the fire took hold of the vehicle 15 or 20 minutes after the original collision. We have a low speed impact and a late onset of a fire. That would be very unusual.
We know from witnesses that he had visited the location in the days leading up to the accident, so he'd effectively recce'd the location. At the predetermined location, he drove the vehicle off the road at a very low speed did impact with a tree with the front of the vehicle, and then emptied petrol fuel in the vehicle, set it on fire, and then passers-by effectively intervened. But remarkably, he maintained at least one, possibly two of the first witnesses who arrived on the scene, because the question was asked, is there anybody else in the vehicle? And he was adamant no.
They were very, very cleverly spun lies. Very calculated and very clever. And they were there to achieve your trust, they were there to achieve your confidence, and they did that.
He actually had the confidence in his own actions to prevent any potential rescue of Claire by the passers-by, which again gives you a depth of insight into how callous this man is.
But as we all know, he had no feelings of guilt. He doesn't have any feelings of guilt. So despite the fact that he's done that despicable thing, he got no guilt on it.
Now, nearly 15 years on from Claire Morris's death, there was solid, tangible evidence to add to the suspicions. But was it enough to convict Malcolm Webster of murder? Webster, at that stage still to be approached by police, called Detective Alan Smith, complaining that he, Webster, was being harassed.
I took a phone call from Webster, who had heard that there was investigations ongoing into the death of Claire, and he was highly indignant. He was pseudo-aggressive in terms of how could you possibly think that I could be involved in anything to do with Claire's death. Very dramatic phone call. Definitely a determined phone call to try and convince somebody on the other end of a phone that he wasn't involved. It struck me as being somewhat pathetic that somebody might think that they could, in a phone call, just douse down the interest in a murder investigation.
It was another example of Webster's front, his cocky belief in himself as a master manipulator.
It was a bizarre phone call, when all it really did was add fuel to the fire, in the sense that gave us more determination that such were the actions. It was bizarre.
He was very confident of his own intelligence, his own planning. He thought that he had covered all the bases, but actually this wasn't a clever man. This was a manipulative man.
Having built a persona around himself, possibly to escape his father's domineering shadow, Malcolm Webster had created a monster, himself.
Because that's what it was. His whole life, adult life, was nothing other than a performance. He was into amateur drama as a young man, and I think he played that through for the rest of his days. I think he lived his life in a complete fantasy, and he was successful in many ways in terms of his goal of making money out of that.
The deadly charade was to come crashing down at his trial for the murder of Claire Morris, the attempted murder of Felicity Drum, and the bigamous attempt to marry Simone Banerjee.
The whole pattern of behaviour by Webster was well described by the judge, who summed up in his trial when he described it as being like a 1,000-piece jigsaw that was strewn across the floor. And until such time as the jigsaw was put together, not just by the police but by family, by friends, there was a whole network who helped put this jigsaw together.
You can't start the process of grieving until you've got the truth. And that's why I say that my mother and I had to grieve twice for Claire. It was a reopening of the scar, because you can't move on or do anything in life until you've got that truth. That's imperative.
Webster was found guilty of his crimes in May 2011 and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 30 years. After 2 appeals and a review, he remains in prison, still protesting his innocence.
He's never shown remorse. He's never admitted his guilt. He maintains his innocence to this day.
From the beginning, the telltale danger signs were there in the character of Malcolm Webster. Behind the calculating, callous facade, he was truly a man made for murder.
Malcolm is a psychopath. He can put himself into a bubble when he's committing a crime, and he can completely detach himself from what he's doing whilst he's doing it.
I think we can look back as far as his childhood at the feigned brain tumour, at the fake fainting episodes at school, and see there the roots of somebody who would do anything to get what he wanted.
Of real-life violence that some viewers may find distressing.
36-year-old Georgina Henshaw styles herself as a pin-up. She exchanges favours for cash.
Georgina is seeing her life as an almost glamorous gangster story in which she is the seductive but very violent female lead.
Hiya. Are we right to come in?
Yeah, of course you are.
Thank you.
Her primary target is 65-year-old restaurant chef and granddad Philip Rolfe.
Philip wanted far more than a friendship. He wanted an intimate relationship, and we know that because he told Georgina that he loved her and he wanted to marry her.
By falling for her charms, had Philip Rolfe signed his own death warrant.
I was arrested here on suspicion of murder.
What?
Paramedics will find him slumped in his blue Hyundai car with a single stab wound to the heart. Soon police link him to Georgina Henshaw.
Very much about it.
Phil's dead.
Yes.
Seriously.
That's why.
It's serious.
By the time Georgina Henshaw met Philip Rolfe, she was already a fully formed murderess in waiting.
The detective story had begun. Was Philip Rolfe the victim of a woman made for murder? What made Georgina Henshaw the killer she became? Using expert digital imagery to show the different faces of an emerging killer, this series reveals the timelines and red flags of those who will one day be investigated for murder.
All the psychological processes, components required for somebody to be able to carry through a violent murder were already there within Georgina Henshaw.
The early hours of a sultry summer morning in Birmingham, and police come calling at the home of a suspected killer.
Are we right to come in?
Yeah, of course you are.
Thank you. Georgina.
Yeah.
The time is 04:17. I was arrested here on suspicion of murder.
What?
Understanding Georgina Henshaw, the woman protesting ignorance of the murder of a former lover, begins with her view of men. Friend Lindsay Chapman grew up with Georgina, and she knew her better than most.
She used to say, this was a motto, men are like disposable nappies. She used to say, use them or throw them away.
Georgina Henshaw sees her emerging sexuality as a weapon to be used against men. This is a woman who is going to go on to develop an aggressive form of sexuality. It's going to go on to develop manipulative, abusive relationships with men.
I think it's more of like a control thing, because I think when you're a bit insecure from a child, it comes out as you're an adult, and especially if you know how to work men, like she did, dress sexy and stuff like that, and obviously she probably enjoyed it.
She liked drinking too. It appears Georgina exhibited behavioural issues as a child, and as a young woman, alcohol became a daily part of her existence.
With Georgina, what we see is someone who's a very childlike self, someone who struggles with things like life skills and relational skills. When somebody has those struggles, often we can find the key back in early life experiences.
It's just all vodka. That's it. So I think maybe, I don't know, maybe she had the vodka to forget.
This was a lady who was a very heavy drinker. She was prone to emotional outbursts. She was perfectly capable of giving vent to her anger.
You'll find that somebody who is suffering something like stress or depression or anxiety, often as a result of a situation in life that they're struggling with, starts to depend on something like alcohol or drugs or gambling as an antidepressant in itself.
Georgina grew up in Chelmsford Wood near the town of Solihull in central England. Her best friend had noticed how she played up in front of boys, and later older men.
At school, she was a bit of a wild one. I don't know, obviously, what went on behind closed doors there or anything, but it did seem like she craved attention from men.
I would guess that clearly there was something in the background that made day-to-day life for Georgina very difficult.
Dr. Donna Youngs is a forensic psychologist. She works with police to dissect the behaviour of killers and spot the red flags that they exhibit. The early teenage readiness to use her sexuality offers a warning of what Georgina Henshaw would go on to do.
Georgina Henshaw is starting to become a bit divorced from reality. She's starting to live out a story that has more similarity to fictional stories of glamorous females and in particular violent glamorous females by this stage. And we see this in a lot of her little behaviours.
I used to tell her about the way she was with men. I didn't like the way she was. That you don't have to allow yourself to be used to get what you want. But she says, I use them. Obviously she felt she was in power of the situation, which she obviously liked.
Georgina would lie to men to string them along. She enjoyed flaunting a persona which saw her as a provocative temptress. It proved attractive enough for some men to fund a lush lifestyle.
It was always older men, and I think it was probably because she was young and she could probably have the power over them.
She misunderstands the power that she's experiencing, and it's driven her on to develop a narcissistic, egotistical internal story, all based around her sexuality.
Often when somebody lies throughout their life, they can end up believing the lies themselves. It's like telling a story. They begin to live in a fantasy story.
Spending on booze, living beyond her means, Georgina was constantly short of money, but she would boast to friends how she could get men to part with their money by turning up her physical charms.
She used to wear wear very seductive clothing, and she just liked the men, but she liked money. So, and I think that was to pay for alcohol.
That was the state of mind of Georgina Henshaw when she began working as a waitress at a restaurant in 2016. It was then that she met a co-worker and 65-year-old grandfather.
Georgina Henshaw and Philip Rolfe worked together in the Toby Carvery in Coventry. Philip was a chef.
An older, vulnerable man is ideal prey for her. So Philip Rolfe was an ideal target for her seductions because he's a little bit vulnerable. He feels a little bit grateful for her attention, and yet he has the resources that she needs.
There was a match. We have Georgina, who was very, very needy and was going through life trying to find somebody who could help her cope with life, a father figure essentially.
The older man, nearly 30 years her senior, appears to have found the young woman's attention flattering.
I think for Philip, meeting Georgina and meeting her need to have her needs met felt good for him, probably helped him to feel powerful and important.
They struck up a friendship. became kind of good friends, but Philip really wanted more.
For a while, their relationship worked. It was a fit. Philip's need to be needed was being met, and Georgina's childlike needs and demands for love and care and attention were being met by Philip.
He lavished money and gifts on Georgina and was really very, very keen to strike up much more of a relationship with her. But she resisted him, but took his money.
She didn't like him, but he gave her a lot of money. Basically, she used to meet him and they just have a drink together.
She was milking other men for money around the same time. When one fell out with her, Georgina showed him no mercy.
It turns out that Georgina Henshaw had a violent history, including attacking a boyfriend and slashing him with a knife.
The fact that Georgina Henshaw is able to stab someone that she knows really quite intimately, quite well by this point, directly, and for that matter, any human, tells us that we're really dealing with an unusual human being here.
And anything you do say may be given evidence.
Are you serious?
By the time Georgina Henshaw met Philip Rolfe, she was already a fully formed murderess in waiting. All the psychological processes, components required for somebody to be able to carry through a violent murder were already there within Georgina Henshaw.
In texts written by Georgina Henshaw that would later emerge, the nature of the woman that 65-year-old Philip Rolfe had fallen for will be revealed. She describes herself as a psycho, prepared to kill if she doesn't get what she wanted. This was a woman playing a fantasy role, and not a nice one.
Philip Rolfe was in danger the moment he showed his susceptibility to Georgina Henshaw's charms. The moment she could see that this power that she'd long learned she could use with men was working with him, he was in danger.
To the forensic psychologist, the possibility that Georgina Henshaw was made for murder was all too clear.
The narcissistic over-response to the reaction of men to a young woman's emerging sexuality is not in and of itself abnormal. But with Georgina, what we get in parallel, she has somewhere along the line bought into a story that glamorizes intense violence.
A female lead in a story who, if only he knew it, was putting Philip Rolfe into a dark world that he was ill-equipped to cope with.
He wanted sexual intimacy with Georgina. He was in love with her. Ultimately, he wanted to marry her. Georgina didn't want those things.
"2017, and Georgina Henshaw has older man Philip Rolfe answering her beck and call, solving her money worries."
They were just friends. The friendship moved on. He was quite generous. He gave her some money, £3,000 for rent arrears. He gave her some money for carpets. As it progressed, it seemed he probably wanted to take things further.
The evidence of the relationship between them indicates that there was a point in time when she will have felt wholly in control.
Georgina fed her self-image, commissioning glamour shots to put on social media.
What we see with Georgina is someone who is in the body of an adult woman in her 30s, but psychologically and emotionally, she is at the stage of between 2 and 4 years old, unable to cope with the world.
Emotionally immature maybe, but still able to get men to part with their money.
Georgina Henshaw was lavished with money and gifts by an older man who clearly wanted to win his way into her affections. She was happy to take all that cash and give nothing in return. With friends like Georgina Henshaw, who needs enemies?
She uses Rolfe to fund her growing alcohol addiction. She's sinking deeper into a world of make-believe. Summer 2017, and Georgina tires of being a waitress.
Georgina quit her job in the restaurant, but her and Philip remained friends and they would meet up. The money that Philip gave her was for booze and cigarettes and that kind of stuff.
Philip tells her that he wants more from their relationship. That was a mistake.
Where we see it start to unravel and ultimately go horribly wrong was when Philip started to have needs himself. He made it plain that what he wanted was for the relationship to grow.
If anyone did want to be serious with Georgina, it would be a no. Even if Phil wanted to. It'd be sex, money, drink. That was her outlook. That's all she wanted. She didn't never want a real relationship. And basically I think Georgina looked at him as a sugar daddy because he did buy her a lot of things.
Philip wanted far more than a friendship. And we know that because he told Georgina that he loved her and he wanted to marry her.
Georgina had no intention of finding domestic bliss with Philip.
She didn't want those things of the adult world. They were too much for her. What she wanted from Philip was for him to treat her as a child. He was meeting her needs for money. He was meeting her needs for protection. She didn't want anything else.
It soon became clear to Philip that Georgina wasn't going to give him what he wanted from the relationship. In June 2017, he rejected her latest request for money. He told her he wanted out.
Philip wasn't stupid, and what we see is that he began to pick up that he was being used by Georgina.
He started to wise up to it, and perhaps he started questioning her as to her motives and was he being used.
Most relationships, I think, when we look at it, are about investment and return. We give and we give, whether that's financially, whether it's emotionally, whether it's psychologically. Most of us get to a stage when we think, well, hang on, I'm investing all of this. What am I getting back? So I think it got to the stage that Philip could see that there was, sadly, nothing there for him.
He made it blatantly clear. So there was going to be no more money, no more friendship.
But rejection of Georgina Henshaw seemed to put her on a path for revenge.
The minute Philip Rolfe lets Georgina know he's onto her, the whole facade, the whole other part of her personality, the seductress, the little girl lost persona that she's been using to manipulate him, she no longer needs to hide that from Philip Rolfe.
She was appalled that her needs would no longer be met, and she used every threat to try to get back the sources of financial support.
Georgina Henshaw will have played a very canny game with Philip Rolfe. She will have kept hidden the biggest part of her personality, which is the driving violence, the emerging psycho, as she calls herself. She will have very cleverly kept that hidden from him.
Barrister John Price has spent many hours in court defending killers and prosecuting them. Part of his job can be to explain the motive for murder.
No doubt she felt that whatever she demanded of him, he would give her. So it may have come of a shock, and she may have deeply resented it when the point arrived, perhaps unexpectedly so far as she was concerned, when she suddenly realised he wasn't going to have any more of it, that he was going to stand up for himself, that he had realised what she was doing.
What we see then is Georgina's childlike rage unleashed.
Georgina hits a downward spiral of drink and fantasy, one where she plays the homicidal lead role.
All the problems that were there in day-to-day life aren't attended, they're not being resolved, so nothing's getting better. Life actually starts to get worse.
When she got drunk, she'd get angrier and angrier.
When Georgina used to have a drink, she used to completely change her personality. It was like Jekyll and Hyde.
Georgina Henshaw became abusive towards Philip. Openly, publicly. Other people could see it. And she even started boasting that she was going to kill him.
The way that Georgina sees men purely in terms of a power battle means that when that power is in any way challenged, Georgina will draw on the emerging story of glamorous violence that she is also building up at the same time.
The rage that Georgina was feeling at what she perceived as a rejection of herself, a cutting off of her source of financial funds and emotional support. It was just like a fuel to the fire of the anger that she felt. And of course the alcohol was the ultimate incendiary device.
A woman convicted already of a knife crime against a boyfriend sets her sights on revenge, and Philip Rolfe is in the crosshairs. June 6th, 2017, and Georgina sends text messages to a friend. They say that Philip is threatening her with a knife to her throat. That's unlikely to be true.
In the hours leading up to Philip's murder, Georgina Henshaw sent messages to a friend. In one of these messages, she claimed that Philip had held a knife to her throat, although that matter was never reported to the police.
Whether an incident of the kind that she describes to her friend in the text message had taken place, whether he had threatened her with a knife, no one will ever know. He seems an unlikely candidate for that. But it does suggest that she realised he wasn't just the puppy dog.
We see her talking about it openly at work. She's sending messages to her friends, talking about how ragingly angry she is. She's talking about planning to harm Philip.
On the 6th of July 2018, Henshaw sent a text to a friend saying that she was full of anger and that she intended on luring him round and she was going to cosh him to death.
On the one hand, it seems she was seeking attention and talking about the awful things that she planned to do with Philip. But she was also saying that she felt she was a psycho. She felt she was out of control. But I don't think Georgina was psychotic, because there was enough of her that was able to stand back and recognise that she was out of control. If somebody is in a state of psychosis, they don't see that. They don't recognise the madness. So I think Georgina was someone who just could not manage the adult world.
I definitely know she was capable of doing it. So I definitely believe Georgina. I knew what she was doing.
There is no subtlety, there's no middle ground like we have in adult relationships. It's that black and white, childlike reaction. You now haven't met my needs, which I feel I have a right to because I see you as my parent, and now I hate you. I'm ragingly angry with you, and I'm going to destroy you.
Late in the evening of June 6th, 2017, Georgina Henshaw had predicted what she was about to do. Kill Philip Rolfe.
What we see is the violent psycho killer, the glamorous gangster, female gangster, as I think she sees herself. We see that, the true part of her personality, the dominant part of her personality, emerging.
She had been a teenager prepared to use her sexuality to control men. She had lived a life of binge drinking and parties. As she had journeyed through the years, Georgina Henshaw had become a woman made for murder. And on a balmy summer evening in Birmingham, England in June 2017, losing grip on reality, Georgina Henshaw is in full psycho mode as she brags to her friends that she's going to kill Philip Rolfe.
She was basically saying that she's setting up to commit a murder. And her friend told her, it's not worth it. But there were further text messages that seemed to suggest that, she felt threatened by this person.
At 9 p.m, she sent a message to a friend in which she said she was full of anger and that she was a psycho and that she was going to cosh Philip to death.
As with most nights, Georgina had been drinking.
Ultimately, we come back to the role of alcohol. Alcohol and anger are an extremely potent, very, very dangerous cocktail?
I believe it's the drink, and drink does alter, obviously, your perception of stuff.
We might say, I'm so angry I could kill them. We don't actually mean it. And we certainly don't act on it. Because for most of us, there's a healthy balance. We might have this intense inner world of childlike feelings and irrational thought, but we've got the stronger part of ourselves in action, the rational adult that can sort of parent that part of ourselves and say, now hang on a minute, I'm going to take a pause, I'm going to step aside, I'm not going to act on those feelings. But for Georgina, that clearly wasn't there.
I think it's safe to say that she had in mind serious violence upon him. But as to exactly in those final few minutes it came about, it's anybody's guess.
Henshaw invites Philip to her house.
Whatever her intention was in bringing him here, he may well have gone there to have it out with her. That, therefore, the circumstances do indicate that there was the potential, not just from her text messages in advance, but from what he had realised was going on, there was the potential for something occurring between the two of them of a violent kind.
The next time anybody heard from Philip again is in the early hours of the morning.
At 12:30 a.m. that night, Philip dials 999. He tells the operator he's been stabbed in the chest. An ambulance is dispatched.
Georgina Henshaw stabbed Philip Rolfe once. Remarkably, he did not die instantly, despite the viciousness of the attack.
This stylized method of murder shows very clearly the way in which she's thinking of herself in this dramatic, glamorous, fictional female murderer role. And it's that story inside her head that she now buys into completely, which is what separates her from any other angry woman.
Philip managed to stumble the short distance to Greenlands Road.
Although he had been stabbed, it would seem, at her home where he had visited her, he had been able to leave. He had been able to make his way on foot to his vehicle and get into the driver's seat. That is by no means unusual in a case where a person sustains a stab wound to the chest. They are often capable of activity of this kind after the wound has been inflicted. Having got back into his car, he was able to make 2 telephone calls, one to his partner and one to the 999 service. According to the material which is available, he seems to have told both his partner and the operator that he had been stabbed, but strangely it would seem not by whom.
On arrival at the scene, police found Philip Roth in his car. He'd been stabbed in the heart. All the efforts of the officers, irrespective of the fact that the car's a crime scene, would be to try and save him. So that's what all their energy would have gone into. Once he'd gone to hospital, and obviously the other officers there, the car would be treated as a crime scene. They would then look and do urgent inquiries, golden hour inquiries as we call them, into what his immediate movements were prior to being in that car, to try and find out how he'd been stabbed.
On the way to Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, Philip Rolfe has a major heart attack and dies. This is now confirmed as a murder investigation, and detectives set to work.
In the first instance, the thing that you have to be in a position to prove is the identity of the killer.
The police examine Philip's phone, and they can tell that he's visited Georgina's house that night, and that he's also had a missed call from her.
Whilst matters are still very fresh, they go about gathering the evidence that would prove that it was Miss Henshaw who had stabbed and killed the deceased. So you would be interrogating her telephone, the police would be conducting searches of her home, they will have tried to seize her telephone and to have interrogated that.
Perhaps most damning for investigators is the discovery of a message that Georgina has sent to her friend after Philip left her house, saying, "I think I've killed him."
The text messages are from someone who, whether she gives a true reason for it or not, is clearly deeply embittered at the deceased.
There was also evidence of an attempted cover-up by Georgina.
There was a text message saying words to the effect of, "Hey babe, why aren't you answering your phone? Are you okay?"
The innocent, caring message was purporting to be one sent by Henshaw to Philip Rolfe earlier the same evening. To seasoned detectives, this was an all-too-obvious ruse by Georgina Henshaw.
Henshaw was trying to create some kind of alibi or excuse for herself in order to deny the fact that it was her who stabbed him.
Investigators in Britain call the period immediately after the discovery of a body the golden hours. The evidence needed to secure convictions is often found during this time.
They found out that he had, they believe, visited Georgina's house just a few hours, potentially even less than that before.
The indications would have been there from a very, very early stage that something had happened between the two of them at her home. His car was parked just round the corner from where she lived, so they would have put the threatening text messages together with the fact that he was so close to where she lived. And it's wholly unsurprising in those circumstances that they went straight round there in the early hours of the morning and arrested her.
Georgina? Yeah. The time is 04:17 hours. I'm arrested here on suspicion of murder.
What?
Georgina Henshaw was now the prime suspect for this murder.
Just going to wait for a van to come round.
Why am I being arrested?
Obviously, I need to question you very much about it.
That Phil's dead?
Yes.
Seriously?
That's why.
It's serious?
Yes.
The challenge had been set to investigators. Did they have enough evidence to prove that Georgina Henshaw was a killer? "65-year-old Philip Rolfe has died of a heart attack after being stabbed."
Hiya.
Hello?
Are we right to come in?
Yeah, of course you are.
Thank you.
Police have firmly connected Georgina Henshaw to the victim, but when arrested, she claims complete ignorance.
The time is 04:17 hours. I'm arrested here on suspicion of murder.
What?
Of Philip Rolfe. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you don't mention when questioned, something which you're later to rely on in court. And anything you do say may be given evidence.
It seemed this would not be a woman ready to confess to murder.
Having completely dropped the seductive, manipulative, coy front to commit a vicious murder, we see Georgina able to very readily re-establish that front. So it comes as soon as the police knock on her door to arrest her, she cleverly, strategically realises that this coy little girl persona will be very useful in this context, and she's able to reinstate it very rapidly.
Just going to wait for a van to come round.
Why am I being arrested?
Obviously, I need to question you. They can't be.
We could see from the body cam footage from the police officers that Georgina Henshaw was shocked and surprised and almost disbelieving that police officers were there to arrest her, and also when she said, "Are you telling me Philip is dead?" She pretended she knew nothing about it.
Very much about
it.
it.
Phil's dead?
Yes.
Seriously?
That's why.
It's serious?
She feigned surprise and acted as though she was sad. But all of that was captured on a police body-worn camera. I strongly suspect that when the detectives looked at that footage, they went, "Oh yeah, crocodile tears."
Anyone else would panic, phone the police and say, "Look what I've just done," wouldn't they? So yeah, definitely calculated a little bit.
Facing the truth can be terrifying. For Georgina to face the truth, then she's going to feel something about her actions. And we have to remember she's a childlike, vulnerable self that can't bear to take responsibility. This is someone who couldn't take responsibility for paying her own rent, buying her own groceries. She doesn't have the psychological or emotional strength to be able to face the reality of what she's done.
The time is 04:17 hours. I'm arrested here on suspicion of murder.
What?
Rationally, on paper, it's going to be obvious to anyone that she's going to be suspected of the murder of Philip.
Are you serious?
But it's like she's playing, again, a childlike game of let's pretend.
Very much about it.
Phil's dead?
Yes.
Seriously?
In police custody, Georgina maintains her innocence. Detectives have to build a case against her to prosecute.
The very first thing that has to be done is to ensure that you have the evidence from which you can prove to the required standard that it was Georgina who killed the deceased. You don't know what her answer to the charge is going to be, at least in the early stages, because this is a case where, when the police arrived at her home, she behaved in a way to suggest that she was wholly ignorant of what had happened to him. And then when she arrived at the police station and was interviewed under caution, she made no reply. So in the very first instance, you need to make sure that you can prove that it was her.
If I was the officer investigating this case, the fact that the victim had been lured to a remote spot would stand out for me. That would tell me that was a deliberate act and that the person responsible for this crime is somebody who clearly knows the victim.
Officers were confused about one thing. Philip had managed to call 999. What he had not said might present difficulty in proving their case. Officers pressed Georgina for answers, but she kept up a front.
When she was interviewed by the police, she lied. She denied that Philip had been round to her flat. The missed call and the text, "Hey babe," and all of that, would stand out to me as being just a ruse by someone to try and deflect attention away from themselves. But of course it has the exact opposite effect, in so much as that I would hone in on that and say, who's this person and why are they messaging?
They put the phone evidence to Georgina.
Police were told by a friend of Georgina's that around the time of this incident, she received a call from her where she said, "I've stabbed him. What if I've killed him?"
There's two very weighty pieces of evidence here. One is the message that says, "I'm set up to murder." And then there's the later conversation where she says, "I've stabbed him. What if I killed him?" You have the premeditated element, and then you have the confession after the event. I'm sure the cops thought they were home and dry when they secured those pieces of evidence.
There was even more. Investigators had found the murder weapon.
The thing that they would be most interested in finding very obviously is the weapon that she used to stab him, where that was in relation to his car or in relation to her home. That would very much be the focus of the investigation.
The evidential icing on the cake was when the police found what they believed to be the murder weapon in Henshaw's back garden.
They recovered a knife, which forensic tests later showed was the knife used to stab Philip Roth.
The murder weapon is secured, and detectives will also have known of Georgina's violent past as they built the case against her. She'd showed her ability to use a knife against another person.
Georgina's background revealed the fact that she had slashed a previous boyfriend. If I were the detective in charge of that case, I would be thinking, we've got the right person here.
We've got the evidence from the phone call, we've got evidence from the friend, we've got the text messages on the phone, we've got the knife recovered. All of this points to one thing only, and this is overwhelming evidence that Georgina stabbed Philip Roth.
The evidence appeared sufficient to prove that Georgina Henshaw had fatally and brutally stabbed Philip Rolfe in the heart. But there was still a glimmer of hope for Georgina that she would escape a life sentence. Could this be a case of manslaughter rather than murder? The legal distinction in cases like this revolves around intent. Did she mean to kill him or cause serious harm? A question prosecutors are often faced with.
All that we have to prove, whatever it was that happened in that home, was that she'd intended to cause him really serious harm. And it's pretty difficult to see how she could have intended anything less, where she stabbed him in the chest with a knife.
Despite that, Henshaw refused to accept hers was a case of murder.
When the case got to court, she admitted stabbing Philip, but denied ever intending to murder him.
Amongst the text messages that she had sent was one suggesting Philip had held a knife to her throat, something there was no corroborating evidence for.
It appears that she indicated that although she had killed him, she was minded to argue that she may have had a lawful reason for doing so, and at the very least did not have the intent that would make her guilty of murder.
Who knows whether Georgina Henshaw intended to kill Philip Roth? What is clear is that she intended to cause him really serious harm. And in order to prove murder, that's all you need to prove.
The evidence here is that whether she meant what she had said in her text messages literally or not, they tend to suggest that this was very far from being a case of self-defence.
In February 2018, a jury at Birmingham Crown Court was asked to weigh up the evidence.
The reason he went there, it would seem at her invitation, is because she intended to use violence upon him. So self-defence, I suspect, would not have detained the jury for very long.
The jury returned a guilty verdict. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with what I believe to be the unduly lenient minimum term of only 16 years.
Georgina Henshaw, 36 years old at the time of the offence, something of a fantasist, a drinker, a manipulator of men.
I couldn't believe, basically, that I could never do that, put a knife in someone. Couldn't do it, and I didn't really, from knowing her from when she was little, I didn't really think Georgina could do that.
Georgina never revealed her real motive for brutally knifing Philip Roth. She started her life sentence on 27th of February 2018. No longer able to turn to drink, would this be a chance for her to gain some sort of personal stability?
It's entirely possible, even for somebody who struggles with the most intense irrational thoughts and strong emotion, to learn how to manage those things, to create what I call the power of the pause in between that knee-jerk reaction we have where everything in us urges us to do something, and actually pausing and thinking about it and responding. I believe that there was an opportunity for Georgina to learn to do exactly that.
It was not an opportunity from which she benefited. The woman, dubbed by the press as the psycho Carvery waitress, fantasized about playing the lead in a story about a seductress, but alone in prison, she played out her final scene. A year after being sentenced, Georgina Henshaw would be found dead in her cell. She had been a woman damaged by life, and very probably had become one made for murder.
We see her describing herself as a psycho, unapologetically. We see her showing no hesitation in discussing her predilection towards murder. And a lot of other comments that she makes show us that Georgina is seeing her life as an almost glamorous gangster story in which she is the seductive but very violent female lead.
真不好说，这不是一个级别的。那个，哎，这200不算贵，比北京的便宜。哎， 我跟北京跳那个，就刚才你们看那视频，那是一个小湖，你知道吧？那个小湖，你给人感觉吧，反正也挺吓人。我操，这他妈面对整个大海，从他妈那往下跳，远处，哎呦，我操，那制空感，妈吓死个人呀！吓死个人呀！这动漫体验是什么？哦，玩3D 啊！哦，这是玩3D 的，穿越瞬间发生。没。有喝的吗？来瓶喝的。有屋子这有风。
下边来杯奶茶吧。
哎呦，喝别的。喝别的。我也看。不吃了，我这美食肚子，我得留晚上吃，我得留晚上看电用。我觉得咱不能吃这个，是咱们来到了，要不就吃外头的，不能把肚子浪费在这上。王哥游泳最起码跳，哎，我跳过，还跳过。火箭蹦迪这边啊，火箭蹦迪我也不蹦。上回那蹦是祥云哥刷了那个6个超火，4个超火，不是几个也忘了，反正是3、4个大超火我才上去的，那玩的命了那是。现在我不跳了，现在他妈是要命的，要命啊！那会儿年轻还行，那会儿我才39岁，现在都40了，不行了。那会儿我30多岁还能干这事儿，现在40多了干不了这事儿了。这已经被废弃了，看来都没人用了。还真是100万热度。你看那岛也没多大，感觉确实没多大，都是个人工岛。那就是个人工岛，就是个人工岛。啊，这上面都是游乐设施，他呀弄了一个人工岛，然后呢，就拿一些人为玩的玩意儿建造下来了，不是什么自然风景区，这是一个人工岛，应该是啊，人建了一个人工岛，没有什么这小孩玩的。一小游乐场，主要就是这个索道。我跟你说，就是这索道赚钱，这基本我估计都没人玩，基本是没人玩。